Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, the place where we slow everything down, take one good look at the past and let the strangest corners of human history become a little less noisy and a little more understandable. Tonight, or this morning, or whatever odd in-between hour has delivered you here, we're going to Mexico, to the ruins of a city so large, so carefully planned, and so stubbornly mysterious that even centuries after its people were gone, later visitors stood among its monuments and decided this could not possibly have been an ordinary place. It had to be where gods were made. That is already a very strong opening statement for a city, and honestly not the sort of review most urban planners get. Before we settle in, I'd love for you to notice where you are for a second. What time is it where you are? Are you listening under a blanket in the dark with one eye half open and the other already negotiating with sleep? Are you on a late walk, in a quiet room, in a car, on a train, somewhere far from Mexico, hearing the name Teotihuacan and feeling that little lift of curiosity that comes when a place sounds familiar and completely unknowable at the same time? However you've arrived, I'm glad you're here. And if this kind of slow, thoughtful wandering is your sort of thing, the kind where archaeology gets to be both serious and slightly eerie, then do the gentle modern ritual and like the video, subscribe to the channel and settle in with me. Because Teotihuacan does something unusual almost immediately. Most ancient places, even the impressive ones, let you build up to the mystery. First you learn where they are, then who lived there, then what they built, and only later do you get to the part where historians begin using phrases like, "we still do not know." Teotihuacan has no interest in that order. It confronts you with uncertainty right from the start. We do not know what its people called it. We do not know exactly how its political system worked. We do not know with certainty who ruled it, how power was shared, or why such an enormous city was laid out with such discipline and maintained with such effort. Even the name most people use, Teotihuacan, did not come from its founders. It came later from Nahuatl-speaking peoples, often identified with the Aztecs, who encountered the site long after it had been abandoned and called it the place where the gods were created, or words very close to that meaning. The city itself lies about 50 kilometers northeast of modern Mexico City, and what survives there today is only part of what once stood. Between roughly the 1st and 7th centuries CEE, it became one of the great urban centres of the ancient world, laid out on geometric principles and marked by immense monuments, especially the pyramids of the sun and the moon, and the temple of the feathered serpent. And that is where the central question begins to take shape, because big ancient cities are not unusual by themselves. Human beings gather, trade, farm, argue, worship, build walls, build markets, build monuments, and generally prove that wherever enough people live together, there will eventually be road systems, public ceremony, and someone important insisting on a better staircase. That part is normal. What makes Teotihuacan feel different is the sense of preparation built into it. Not just growth, not just power, not just devotion, but preparation. The city was not thrown together, it was arranged. The great avenue that runs through it, often called the Avenue of the Dead, was not the result of houses popping up wherever someone found a nice view. The monumental core was aligned and organised. Vast structures rose where they were meant to rise. Residential compounds housed many people in a city that, at its height, may have had around 100,000 inhabitants, and perhaps far more depending on which estimate you trust, making it one of the largest cities on Earth in its time. It was not an isolated ceremonial oddity in the hills. It was a real city with neighbourhoods, labour, hierarchy, trade and administration, connected by long-distance networks reaching far beyond the valley. It influenced other regions, exchanged goods with distant places, and drew in people from different backgrounds, including foreigners who lived in their own districts. In other words, this was not a lonely pyramid complex waiting for tourists and school groups. It was a functioning, crowded, organised urban giant. Now, if that were all, we could simply admire it, nod respectfully, and carry on. ancient city, very large, very impressive, excellent stonework, shame about the missing written records. But Teotihuacan keeps nudging the mind in a more unsettling direction. The scale of effort there seems to exceed the needs of ordinary civic life. The city was built with a seriousness that feels almost anticipatory. Monumental architecture in the ancient world always serves many purposes at once. It displays power, organises ritual, anchors identity, and gives communities a way to make belief visible. Yet in Teotihuacan, the repetition, planning, and symbolic force of the whole layout suggest that the people who built it were not merely decorating their world. They were shaping it according to a model they considered important, necessary, and perhaps urgent. The city feels like a place arranged to align human life with something larger than daily survival. Sky, mountain, water, time, sacred history, political order, divine legitimacy, agricultural stability, social discipline. All of these are possible pieces of the puzzle, and that is where the title of this story becomes useful, because what were they preparing for is not meant as a dramatic trick. It is a real historical question, even if the answers come in several layers. Were they preparing for ritual events, for seasonal cycles, for cosmic renewal, for the management of a vast and fragile population, for drought, crisis, and political uncertainty, for death and rebirth on a scale woven into the city itself? Or, in the simplest sense, were they building a machine for keeping the world in order before the world had the chance to come apart? That kind of question can sound larger than life very quickly, so it helps to bring it back down to earth for a moment. Imagine you arrive at a city and almost everything about its main spaces tells you that public life here was not casual. The buildings are enormous. The processional routes are deliberate. The sacred architecture is not tucked away politely in a corner like a local chapel beside the bakery. It dominates. It instructs. It gathers people into patterns. You do not wander into a place like that and assume the people in charge were mostly focused on light civic housekeeping. You assume ceremony mattered. You assume collective behaviour mattered. You assume the city was built to produce a certain experience in the people living there and in the people visiting from beyond it. Teotihuacan was, among other things, a demonstration. It showed order. It staged order. It may even have persuaded people that order existed because the city itself made it visible. That is a very old kind of power, and a very effective one. If you can convince thousands of people that the world has a centre, that the centre is here, and that your rituals keep the relationship between humans and gods properly managed, then you're doing far more than running a city. You're running reality, or at least presenting yourself as the management team. Archaeology gives us some support for taking that possibility seriously. The city was not only monumental, it was influential. Official descriptions and decades of research describe it as a major centre of politics, economy, religion, and culture, with relations extending across broad parts of Mesoamerica and influence felt in places as distant as Tikal. Its urban design was remarkably structured, and its major monuments were integrated into a larger plan rather than standing as isolated marvels. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent, the Ciudadela complex, the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, residential compounds, markets or administrative spaces, mural programs and buried offerings all point to a city in which symbolism and governance were deeply entangled. At the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, archaeologists have identified dedicatory offerings that included human remains, a reminder that public architecture here was not just decorative or commemorative. Construction itself could be a sacred act, and sacred acts could be costly in very literal human terms. If you're building on that scale and burying offerings beneath what you build, you're not preparing for nothing. And yet one of the most fascinating things about Teotihuacan is that it refuses to give us the kind of easy villain, hero, or event that would make the whole story feel tidy. There is no one surviving text that says, "Here is why we built the city this way, here is the schedule, Here is the theological manual. Here is the emergency plan for maintaining cosmic order. Please file it in the archive. Ancient cities are inconsiderate like that. They leave us murals, foundations, offerings, alignments, apartment compounds, traces of burned buildings, tunnels, skeletons, tools, trade goods, and occasional moments where archaeologists get very excited about a hole opening in the ground, because it might lead to a passage no one has entered in centuries. Which, to be fair, is exciting. Teotihuacan has rewarded exactly that kind of patience. Excavations and surveys have revealed tunnels, buried chambers, and complicated ceremonial spaces, including discoveries beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent that suggest carefully staged ritual landscapes beneath the city's surface. These are not the ruins of a culture sleepwalking through habit. They are signs of people investing enormous thought into what lay above, what lay below, and how the two are meant to connect. So when we ask what they were preparing for, we are really asking several more manageable questions at once. What sort of future did the builders of Teotihuacan imagine? What risks did they believe threatened the world they knew? What events did they expect to return, whether in the heavens, the seasons, or the political life of the city? And how much of this urban plan was meant to reassure people that these forces could be managed if the correct structures stood in the correct places and the correct rituals were carried out by the correct hands? This may sound remote, but it is not so strange. Modern societies also build for futures they fear and futures they desire. We build levees because water rises. We build observatories because the sky matters. We build capitals in planned forms because governments like straight lines almost as much as they like impressive entrances. We make memorials, data centres, bunkers, stock exchanges, cathedrals, laboratories and stadiums, and each one says something about what we think is coming next. Teotihuacan did the same, only with a level of integration that still makes later cities look a bit untidy by comparison. It also helps to remember that cities in ancient Mesoamerica were not simply places where people lived near each other for convenience. They were often active models of the cosmos, landscapes made meaningful through orientation, symbolism, sacred geography, and the controlled movement of bodies through space. Mountains were not just mountains, caves were not just holes in the ground. Springs, plazas, temples, stairways, and cardinal directions could all matter at once, politically and spiritually. At Teotihuacan, that becomes especially important because the city presents itself less like a collection of buildings and more like an argument expressed in stone. Walk here, ascend there, gather here, witness this, understand your place, understand the city's place, understand, perhaps, that the city stands between danger and continuity. That last part matters, because one strong possibility running through all interpretations of Teotihuacan is maintenance. Not maintenance in the modern property management sense, though someone absolutely had to keep track of repairs and probably hated when people tracked mud into formal areas. I mean cosmic maintenance, agricultural maintenance, political maintenance. The work of keeping cycles reliable, keeping the rains coming, keeping legitimacy visible, keeping a very large population convinced that order was real and could endure. This is one reason Teotihuacan can feel almost tense, even in ruin. The city had confidence, but it may also have had anxiety. Large, organized ritual systems often emerge not because people feel perfectly safe, but because they do not. If your world depends on rains arriving, crops maturing, alliances holding, trade routes staying open, social classes accepting their place, and the gods remaining adequately respected, then life contains a great many points of failure. Under those conditions, preparation becomes sacred, precision becomes sacred, repetition becomes sacred. You do not leave things to chance if chance looks a lot like famine, revolt, drought, military pressure, or divine displeasure. A city like Teotihuacan may therefore be read not only as an achievement but as a response, a very large, highly disciplined response to uncertainty. Not panic exactly, more like institutionalized vigilance with excellent architecture. And then there is the human side of it, which I think is worth keeping close as we move forward. It is easy when speaking about monumental ruins to let them become abstract almost by accident. We say the city, the builders, the elite, the ritual class, and soon everyone begins to sound like a well-organized cloud of intentions. But Teotihuacan was full of actual people. Children were raised there. Craftspeople made things there. Merchants travelled in and out. Priests or officials or administrators, however exactly those roles worked, had to persuade, instruct, and supervise. Workers hauled materials. Residents cooked, cleaned, quarrelled, loved, recovered from illness, worried about harvests, and went out into streets dominated by structures larger than anything most of them could ever hope to build themselves. Imagine being born into that city. You would not experience the pyramids as isolated wonders. You would experience them as facts, as part of the world, as part of what adults took seriously, as things that existed before you and would you assumed exist after you. That is one of the strongest tools any civilization has, to make its system feel natural by surrounding people with it from the beginning. Which is why the silence of Teotihuacan today feels so loud. Because once there were crowds, once the plazas held voices, once the city did what it had been built to do, and at some point whatever balance had sustained it began to break. Archaeological evidence indicates major violence in the city's central area in the mid-6th century, with important buildings damaged, apparently by internal groups rather than outside invaders sweeping in from some dramatic horizon. That detail matters. It suggests that whatever Teotihuacan was preparing for, whatever order it meant to sustain, the greatest danger may eventually have come from within the system itself. That is not unusual in history, but it is always sobering. A city can be built to hold the cosmos steady and still fail to hold its own centre. Later people found it diminished, then abandoned, and filled the silence with myth. That too is a very human response. When faced with ruins large enough to outlive their explanation, we start telling stories big enough to match the stones, so that is where we begin. Not with a neat answer, because Teotihuacan does not permit one that early, and not with a grand declaration that we have solved the mystery before the night is halfway gone. Better to start with the feeling the place creates and then ask why. Why did people build a city on this scale in this valley? Why did they organise it so carefully? Why were sacred spaces, processional routes, buried offerings and public monuments made to work together with such force? Why did later people look at the remains and decide this was the place where gods came into being? Most of all, what kind of future requires this much preparation? A city does not become one of the largest in the ancient world by accident, and it does not cover itself in meaning unless meaning is doing real work there. Somewhere inside its pyramids, its alignments, its tunnels, its apartment compounds, its murals and its ruined ceremonial core is a way of thinking about danger, continuity, and the maintenance of the world. And before we can get anywhere near an answer, we need to slow down even further and look at the place itself. Because Teotihuacan did not only grow large, it was made to feel inevitable, and that is where the real story begins to gather. What later people saw when they reached the ruins was not just an old city. It was a place so oversized, so carefully arranged, and so obviously built for public ceremony that ordinary language seems to have failed almost at once. That matters because the title we're using here, The Place Where Men Became Gods, does not come from the city's own surviving voice. As far as archaeologists can tell, the original name of the city is unknown. The name Teotihuacan was given much later by Nahuatl-speaking peoples, and official Mexican and UNESCO sources both note that it was understood as the place where gods were created, while the Plaza of the Columns project at Teotihuacan also gives the related sense, the place where men become gods, or the city of the gods. In other words, even the name most of us know is already an interpretation, already a reaction, already a statement that this was not a place anyone could walk through, without feeling that ordinary human scale had been left behind somewhere out on the road. That is one of the first things worth sitting with, because it tells us something important about memory. By the time these later visitors encountered the city, Teotihuacan had already fallen. Its political power had long since broken down, the core had suffered destruction, and the people naming it were not standing there as citizens reading street signs and chatting with local guides who could explain which district handled tax grain and which compound specialised in shell inlay. They were looking at monumental remains. They were looking at a place that had outlived its explanations. UNESCO notes that after the city's destruction and abandonment around the middle of the first millennium, the ruins became wrapped in legend, while the Mexican National Institute of Anthropology and History says that later Uto-Aztecan-speaking groups passed through an abandoned landscape and, impressed by the half-ruined grandeur, called it Teotihuacan, place of the gods, or place of deification. That response makes sense. Human beings are very consistent about one thing. When a site is too large to feel normal and too old to remember clearly, we do not reduce it to something practical. We elevate it. We assume giants, founders, culture heroes, or gods. If the place is dramatic enough, preferably all four. And in the Nahua and later Mexica imagination, Teotihuacan did not become sacred in some vague decorative way. It became attached to one of the most serious ideas available, creation under conditions of danger. Britannica's account of Aztec religion explains that the universe was understood as unstable, threatened again and again by destruction, and that the current world was the fifth great era or sun. In that same tradition, the gods assembled in darkness at Teotihuacan, built a great fire, and two deities cast themselves into it, emerging as the sun and moon. The story does not stop there, which is what makes it so revealing. The new sun then refused to move until the other gods also gave their blood. So even in later memory, Teotihuacan was not simply where light appeared, it was where light had to be paid for. The world did not begin there because everything was easy and full of cheerful confidence. It began there because motion, time, and continuity demanded sacrifice. That is a very different kind of sacredness. It turns the city into a place where existence itself had to be pushed into operation. Now, it would be extremely tempting at this point to take the later myth, hold it up like a flashlight, and announce that we have solved the city. Mystery finished, everyone go home, the gods did it. But ancient history is rarely that polite. The people who built Teotihuacan were not the Aztecs. The city reached its height many centuries earlier. The Metropolitan Museum describes it as the largest city of the ancient Americas, with perhaps 125,000 to 200,000 residents, at its peak around 400 CE, and emphasises both its monumental ceremonial architecture and its exceptionally orderly layout. The same source notes that its core monuments were burned around 550 CE, and that its influence continued across Mesoamerica long after its decline. So we have to be careful. Later Nahua and Mexica stories tell us with great force how the ruins were understood centuries after the city's collapse. They do not give us a direct transcript of what the original inhabitants thought they were doing. But later stories are still valuable, because they show us what the ruins themselves suggested. A city can communicate across centuries through scale alone. Teotihuacan looked like a place where the world had been organised on purpose. Later people responded accordingly. This is where the phrase, "where men became gods," becomes especially useful, because whether we translate the name as "where gods were created," place of deification, or "where men become gods," the shared idea is transformation. Something changed there. A boundary was crossed there. The ordinary became charged with something more than ordinary. That is a very strong clue for how the site functioned in memory, and maybe also for why its architecture was so effective. Teotihuacan's great monuments were not hidden inside a mountain valley, like a secret retreat for a tiny religious club with strict sandals-only rules. They were arranged in a ceremonial core of enormous visibility. UNESCO highlights the immense Avenue of the Dead, and the grouping of sacred monuments and places of worship. The Met notes that the city's 3 great temple platforms sat along a north-south ceremonial causeway, with stairways facing that route and permitting elites to ascend in moments of ritual activation, using the pyramids almost like theatrical stages. If later people felt this was where humans and gods came dangerously close to each other, part of the reason is simple. The city had been designed to make public ritual look enormous, elevated and world-defining. It is also worth noticing that many of the names we use today are later names, which adds another layer of distance. The Avenue of the Dead is not what the original builders called it. The Met gives its Nahuatl name as Mikautli, the Street of the Dead, and modern explanations note that later visitors believed the flanking mounds were tombs. The Great Pyramids we call the Sun and the Moon are also names given long after the city was abandoned. That means the landscape most modern visitors imagine is already filtered through later interpretation, especially later sacred interpretation. We are not just inheriting the city, we are inheriting the city plus a powerful act of remembrance, and that remembrance kept insisting on the same point. This place was not merely old, it was cosmically old. It was tied to origins. It was the sort of place where time itself might have started keeping count. When a civilization gives a ruin that kind of role, it is telling you that the site felt like a beginning, even in decay. You can probably feel how this changes the emotional climate of the whole story. If Teotihuacan had merely been remembered as a prosperous market city with some unusually competent stoneworkers, it would still be historically important, but it would not generate the same atmosphere. Instead, it was remembered as a place where the gods once gathered in darkness to solve a cosmic emergency. Britannica's summary of Aztec belief says that the world was unstable, continually threatened by destruction, and that the survival of the universe depended on offerings that sustained the sun. When that worldview fastens onto Teotihuacan, the city becomes more than a ruin and more than a memory. It becomes a site of maintenance, a place where existence had once stalled and had to be restarted, a place where the machinery of time required fuel. Suddenly the monuments do not just look large, they look responsible. They look like structures built under the assumption that the universe might not stay in motion by itself. That does not mean the original builders literally held the later Mexica version of the Fifth Sun story. It does mean later peoples found the city perfectly suited to that kind of myth, and that is telling in itself. There is another interesting detail here, and it is one of those details that can slip by if you are not paying attention, because it sounds so normal once you have heard it 100 times. The later Mexica did not treat Teotihuacan as an irrelevant relic. UNESCO says 16th century writings described Moctezuma making sacrifices there every 20 days, evidence that the place remained sacred long after its founding civilization had disappeared. Think about that for a moment. This was not casual tourism with solemn faces and some respectful murmuring before everyone headed off for lunch. This was ritual return. The ruins remained active in religious memory. They still mattered enough to be revisited, enough to receive offerings, enough to serve as a point of connection to cosmic history. A city abandoned for centuries still held enough force to demand ceremony from a later empire. That is not the afterlife of an ordinary place. That is the afterlife of a location believed to stand close to the foundations of the world. All of this also sharpens our central question in a very productive way. When we ask what the people of Teotihuacan were preparing for, this later memory suggests one answer before archaeology has even finished unlacing its boots. They were preparing at the very least for a world in which order could not be taken for granted. The later Mexica myth says the gods gathered in darkness and had to sacrifice themselves to make the sun move. The city's surviving monumental form, meanwhile, is one of extraordinary order, ceremonial emphasis, and controlled public experience. Even without forcing the later myth backward onto the original inhabitants, the fit is remarkable. Both the myth and the city revolve around the same basic concern. How does a world stay in motion? And what does it cost to keep it there? If you wanted to build a place that told generations of observers that cosmic order was managed here, you would not do much differently. You would create broad ceremonial ways, monumental elevations, highly visible ritual stages, and a built environment large enough to humble the individual while reassuring the collective that someone, somewhere, had hold of the system. That, I think, is why the phrase, "the place where men became gods," should not be treated as a bit of romantic decoration pinned to the ruins by later storytellers who got carried away. It is more useful than that. It tells us how overwhelming Teotihuacan remained to people who had not built it and did not inherit its institutions. It tells us that the city still radiated transformation. It tells us that the architecture itself could persuade later minds that something world-changing had happened here. And it tells us that when you strip away the missing documents and the lost names and the vanished rulers, one thing remained obvious. This was a place built to elevate certain acts far above daily life. The stairways, the platforms, the controlled axes of movement, the relationship between monumental structures and broad processional space, all of it pushed human bodies into a hierarchy of sight and scale. Some people stood below, some ascended, some watched, some officiated, some were close to the sacred threshold and most were not. That is the kind of urban language later myths hear very clearly. They hear, in stone, that here the human did not stay merely human. It may even help to imagine the later visitors in practical terms rather than legendary ones. They arrive from a living political world into a dead one. They see an avenue running through a ceremonial centre, laid out with a confidence their own cities would recognise. They see pyramids so large they seem less constructed than imposed. They see order without explanation, grandeur without living administrators, sacred geometry without priests available to brief the newcomers on proper site etiquette. Of course a myth rushes in. Of course the mind reaches for origins. Of course the place becomes where gods once made the sun and moon, where darkness was broken, where sacrifice first set time moving. That is not foolishness. That is interpretation under pressure from architecture. Teotihuacan was persuading people even after it had lost the ability to speak its own language. And still, because this city is incapable of letting us rest on any one answer for too long, the later myth only carries us part of the way. It tells us how the ruins were understood, but it does not fully explain why the living city was built with such exacting discipline in the first place. For that, we have to stop standing at the level of legend and start looking more closely at the actual city plan, because the plan is where Teotihuacan begins to feel less like a collection of impressive buildings and more like a deliberate system. The Met describes an orderly ceremonial centre, a gridded street network, and a city orientation set slightly east of due north, while UNESCO emphasises the geometric and symbolic principles behind the main monuments. Those are not the signs of a place that simply expanded around a shrine because people found the area convenient and the property taxes surprisingly forgiving. They are the signs of a city arranged according to ideas, and probably very serious ones. Once you notice that, where men became gods starts to sound less like an ending and more like a clue left on the doorstep. Because if later people believe divinity touched Earth there, then the next thing we need to understand is how the streets themselves were drawn to make that believable. The first thing to understand about Teotihuacan is that its streets do not feel accidental. Plenty of ancient cities grew in ways that make immediate human sense. A path becomes a road becomes a market lane, a shrine attracts houses, a wall bends around some inconvenient piece of ground, and centuries later the whole place looks like what it is, which is life accumulating. Teotihuacan gives a different impression. Even in ruin, even with broken walls and absent roofs and names lost long ago, it still carries the mood of a place that was laid out before it was lived in. The order meets you before the details do. The main ceremonial artery, the avenue later called the Street of the Dead, runs through the monumental core for about 1.5 miles, roughly 130 feet wide, and from that line a gridded urban system branches outward. The Metropolitan Museum describes the result very plainly. A complex urban grid including both public monuments and residential apartment compounds, unique in Mesoamerica for its scale and organisation. UNESCO goes even further and calls the site a model of urbanisation and large-scale planning. That is why the city can feel almost secretive. Not because the plan is hidden, but because the plan is too consistent to be casual. It suggests that someone or some institution knew exactly what kind of city this was meant to be before most of it existed. Once you notice that, the Avenue of the Dead stops looking like a very impressive road and starts looking more like an instruction. Later, Nahua speakers gave it the name Miccautli, the Street of the Dead, probably because the flanking mounds looked like tombs. But for the living city it seems to have been something much more active. A formal route, a ceremonial spine, a way of moving bodies through space so that the city could stage itself properly. Smart History's site tour puts it well when it describes the avenue as creating a formal, processional, ritualized approach, and that is hard to miss. If you walk such a road in an ordinary settlement, it feels oversized. If you walk it in Teotihuacan, it feels correct, which tells you immediately that the city expected large movement, repeated movement, meaningful movement. Processions, gatherings, controlled visibility, public ceremony, perhaps the steady reminder that this city was not merely where people happened to live, it was where they were expected to assemble, observe, and be arranged. The city is teaching behaviour through width alone. It is saying, there will be many of you, you will move this way, and what waits ahead is meant to be seen together. The orientation makes the whole thing even more deliberate. The Avenue of the Dead is not set to true north. The Met notes that it establishes a spatial orientation of 15.5 degrees east of due north, and from that skewed line the rest of the gridded street system follows. That little angle matters more than it first seems to. A city that large does not drift into a consistent off-cardinal orientation by mistake. And the same Met essay notes that archaeoastronomers have argued the placement of major buildings likely reflects alignments with the Sun and Venus on dates important to religious and agricultural calendars. At the same time, the same source is careful not to overpromise certainty. Some scholars think the monumental architecture was laid out according to a master plan, while others think the great constructions emerged without one fixed blueprint, but followed strong guiding principles that eventually produced the same imposing coherence. That disagreement is worth keeping. It reminds us that even when archaeologists can see the lines clearly, the mechanism behind them remains partly out of reach. But either way, whether a single grand design or a disciplined sequence of choices, the result is the same for anyone entering the city. Teotihuacan was not just built, it was oriented, it was tuned. The angle itself feels like evidence that the streets were doing more than solving traffic. It also becomes clear very quickly that the streets were not merely imposed on the landscape. The landscape was recruited into the plan. UNESCO notes that the city's urban design integrated natural elements of the Teotihuacan Valley, and that the course of the San Juan River was altered so it could cross the Avenue of the Dead. Smart History likewise points out that a second major route ran perpendicular to the main avenue along the river, helping define the grid of intersecting horizontal and vertical corridors that structured the city plan. That is an extraordinary thing to pause over. When a city changes a river to fit its urban logic, it is making a very confident statement about power. Human order is not waiting for topography to be convenient. Human order is reorganizing topography, and yet the relationship is not simply domination. The same sources stress harmony with the environment, and later viewers standing by the Pyramid of the Moon can still see Cerro Gordo framing the northern end of the city. So the plan of Teotihuacan seems to do two things at once. It disciplines the valley by rerouting water and locking architecture into measured lines. But it also cooperates with the valley by treating mountains, horizons and natural forms as part of the city's larger meaning. The result is not nature erased by geometry. It is nature absorbed into geometry. That helps explain why the city never feels like a random pile of impressive monuments. The pyramids are not just large objects standing near each other, because there happen to be room. The pyramids of the sun and moon, as the Met notes, served as focal points for Teotihuacan's urban layout, and the Moon Pyramid in particular sits at the northern end of the avenue, with Cerro Gordo rising behind it, creating one of those visual relationships so effective that it can survive the collapse of the entire civilization that designed it. Smart History describes this as a harmonious relationship between architecture and natural topography, and that is a fair description, but the effect is stronger than harmonious can sometimes suggest. The Moon Pyramid does not simply sit beneath the mountain. It reads almost like the mountain's public, civic version. The mountain turned into a controlled architectural statement and placed at the end of the city's most important line. The same older Met essay on the Sun and Moon pyramids says both monuments echo the shapes of the mountain surrounding the valley, which means the city was not only measuring land, it was translating landscape into urban form. Once you see that, the streets begin to look less like routes between buildings and more like a way of organising relationships among mountain, monument, cave, plaza, procession, and sky. And then there is the other half of the plan, the half that makes Teotihuacan feel even more unusual than its monuments do. The ceremonial core was immense, but it was only a fraction of the whole settlement. UNESCO says that despite its imposing size, the ceremonial centre represented only about 10% of the city's total surface, while the larger urban area at its peak stretched over 36 square kilometres. The Met says that at around 400 CE, the city covered roughly 8 square miles and may have held 125,000 to 200,000 residents. That is not a ceremonial site with a few supporting houses, that is a metropolis. And most of those people did not live in flimsy clusters casually scattered around the sacred centre. According to the Met, somewhere between 2,000 and 2,300 apartment compounds housed about 85% of the population, typically in single-storey complexes measuring around 200 by 200 feet and built around open courtyards behind thick walls. Smart History also notes thousands of apartment complexes on the same grid plan. This matters because the city's logic did not stop at the pyramids. Order was extended into ordinary residents. The same culture that aligned its ceremonial core so carefully also gave a very large share of its population a standardized, stable form of housing, unique for the region. The discipline of the plan reached the home. That is one of the strongest reasons the layout feels secretive in the best possible sense. The secret is not hidden underground, at least not yet. The secret is that Teotihuacan was teaching a complete way of living through design. When most people hear about ancient cities, they imagine a sacred centre, and then a looser ring of daily life beyond it, as though religion happens in the monumental zone, and ordinary existence begins once you walk far enough away from the big staircase. Teotihuacan resists that separation. The city's grid linked religious, domestic and commercial complexes into one structural logic, and Smart History notes that this coherence supported management of the city and its population. Even the possible functions of major southern complexes reinforce the point. The Met suggests the Great Compound may have served as a centralised market, and that the Street of the Dead complex may have functioned as an elite administrative centre. In other words, the avenue did not simply join temples to other temples. It connected ceremony to trade, trade to governance, governance to residence. Teotihuacan was not a ritual district attached to a city. The entire city appears to have been composed so that ritual, administration, economy, and domestic life all sat inside one organising framework. That is a much more powerful kind of planning. It means the streets were not neutral lines on the ground. They were the channels through which the whole system recognised itself. The architecture itself reinforces that feeling of a shared urban language. UNESCO points to the talud tablero style as one of the signature features of Teotihuacan's civil and religious construction, and once you start noticing that repeated profile, the city feels even more intentional. Repetition in architecture does useful political work. It makes a place legible. It tells people, even without words, that these structures belong to the same order. It creates rhythm without needing subheadings. And yes, the city was apparently just as fond of visual consistency as any modern institution that insists on a very serious branding manual. The difference is that Teotihuacan's design manual was written in stone and plaster. The painted walls, the repeated building forms, the standardized compounds, the monument alignments, the causeway itself. All of it would have made the city feel internally coherent to its inhabitants. Not chaotic, not improvised, not experimental, solid, deliberate, maybe inevitable. When UNESCO describes the layout as based on cosmic harmony, that may sound grand, but in practical terms it means the city was built to make its organising principles feel larger than preference. The geometry was not there simply because someone liked neat lines. The neat lines were part of the claim that the city's order corresponded to a deeper order. That deeper order may also have been temporal. The Met's essay notes that important buildings probably align with celestial bodies on dates meaningful to Mesoamerican religious and agricultural calendars. That does not mean every stone in Teotihuacan is a coded astronomical spreadsheet waiting for someone with enough patience and very strong knees to decode it on sight. But it does mean time was likely being built into space. If certain orientations marked significant solar or Venus events, then walking the city was also a way of inhabiting a calendar. The streets and monuments would not just organise people socially, they could help organise expectation. When do rains matter? When do rituals happen? When is a transition in the agricultural year made visible? Those are not trivial concerns in a large urban state. If the city's plan helped turn celestial observation into civic and sacred routine, then the grid was doing a kind of quiet administrative work at the scale of the cosmos. It was making time visible enough to manage, and that once again nudges us back toward the bigger question behind this whole story. A place built with that degree of care is not merely commemorating the world, it is trying to keep pace with it. There is another reason the streets feel like a secret, and it has less to do with astronomy or geometry than with human perspective. Most of the people who lived in Teotihuacan never saw the full plan the way we do from maps, drone images and tidy diagrams in books. They knew it by walking it. They knew it from compounds, plazas, stairways, walls and processions. They experienced order not as an abstract overview but as repeated movement through controlled space. That is important, because a city does not need its residents to understand the whole plan intellectually in order for the plan to shape them. It only needs them to feel that some paths are formal, some thresholds matter, some monuments dominate, and some directions seem to carry authority. The fact that the grid still looks so clean to us from above is almost a side effect of the deeper achievement, which is that the city could teach hierarchy, collectivity, and sacred attention on the ground, day after day, simply by making certain routes unavoidable and certain views overwhelming. The secret, then, is not hidden meaning locked away for specialists. The secret is how efficiently design can become habit. Teotihuacan may have been one of the ancient world's clearest demonstrations that if you control space, you can quietly control experience. And that may be why later people responded to the ruins with such awe. Even stripped of paint, priests, rulers, music, traffic and explanation, the city still looks planned at a level that exceeds ordinary need. It still gives the impression that its builders were arranging more than a settlement. They were arranging relations among people, powers, and places. That impression survives because the plan survives. The line of the avenue survives. The framing of the pyramid survives. The adapted river survives in the archaeological record. The ordered compounds survive. The alignment survives. Even disagreement among scholars over whether this came from a single master plan or from rigorously shared principles does not really weaken the point. It strengthens it, because either explanation still leaves us with a society capable of maintaining urban discipline on an astonishing scale. However they managed it, Teotihuacan made straight lines feel sacred and made sacred things feel built into the routine of city life. That is why its streets can seem drawn like a secret. Not because we cannot see them, but because they still hint at a system of thought larger than any single monument can explain. And once a city begins to feel that deliberate, the next question almost asks itself, if the streets were set with this much care, if the mountains were echoed, if the river was redirected, if the grid ran from public monument into ordinary residence, then one of the biggest structures in the city stops looking like a mere centerpiece and starts looking like a key. Because at Teotihuacan, one of the most important lines on the surface seems to lead directly towards something older, darker, and buried underneath. At Teotihuacan, one of the most important things you can do is stop thinking of a pyramid as just a tall building. That sounds obvious, but it is surprisingly hard to keep hold of, because modern eyes are very good at seeing monuments as finished surfaces. We look at the stairs, the mass, the height, the profile against the sky, and we assume the main story is the visible one. Teotihuacan makes that approach feel incomplete almost immediately. The Pyramid of the Sun, the largest structure in the city and one of the largest ever built in the ancient Americas, was not placed on empty ground in any simple sense. It was built over a cave. The Metropolitan Museum notes that excavations in 1971 revealed a tunnel-like cave beneath the pyramid, ending in a cloverleaf-shaped set of chambers that appears to have hosted ancient fire and water rituals. Smart History also states that the pyramid was built over a cave, and that scholars have linked caves in Mesoamerican thought to places of origin and fertility. That changes the whole emotional weight of the building. Once you know that, the monument stops being only a mountain made by people, and starts looking like a mountain placed over an opening, almost as if the builders were sealing, marking, protecting, and dramatizing a point where the world above and the world below touched each other. And the scale of the thing only makes that choice feel more deliberate. UNESCO describes the Pyramid of the Sun as standing on a massive terrace, roughly 225 by 222 meters at the base and about 75 meters high, while the Met gives a completed height of around 63 meters and a square footprint of roughly 215 meters. The precise numbers differ slightly depending on source and reconstruction history, but the point does not. This was an enormous project, a monument large enough to dominate the city and to stay dominant even after centuries of erosion, excavation, and restoration. The Met also stresses that the pyramid's present appearance reflects major reconstruction and consolidation work carried out in the early 20th century, while Smart History reminds readers that the structure was heavily reconstructed, so its original shape may have looked somewhat different. That caution matters because it prevents us from treating the modern silhouette as a perfect snapshot of ancient intention. Even so, the underlying fact remains unchanged. The city's most imposing mass was raised over a subterranean feature that seems to have mattered deeply. That is not an incidental detail buried in an archaeological appendix. That is a clue almost too large to miss. The simplest way to put it is this. Teotihuacan did not merely build upward. It built around a downward place first. The cave under the Pyramid of the Sun is one of those details that makes an entire civilization seem more purposeful. The Met suggests that the cave may have been a place of emergence, the womb from which the first humans came into the world in central Mexican thought, and it adds that the location and orientation of the cave may have been the impetus for the pyramid's alignment and construction. That is an extraordinary possibility. It suggests the monument was not just commemorating power in the ordinary sense, not merely functioning as a raised stage for elite display or a big civic statement visible from several neighbourhoods away. It may have been marking an origin point, a place where life began, or where life was imagined to begin. If that is even roughly correct, then the pyramid was doing something more serious than glorifying rulers. It was fixing the city to a source. It was telling everyone, through mass and stone and effort, that this was where the world opened, or where it had once opened, and that this opening required permanent attention. That is the kind of decision a society makes when it thinks beginnings are not safely in the past. This matters even more in Mesoamerican context because caves were not treated as empty, geological oddities. Across Mesoamerican traditions, caves were associated with emergence, fertility, the underworld, and access to powers not available on the ordinary surface of daily life. Smart History says art historians have suggested creation mythology may be at issue at the Pyramid of the Sun, because Aztec and Maya sources refer to caves as places of origin and fertility. The older Met essay says plainly that caves are a key part of symbolic imagery, associated with creation myths and the underworld throughout Mesoamerican history. So when the builders of Teotihuacan turned a cave into the hidden centre of an immense pyramid, they were almost certainly not covering a convenient hole in the ground because it was awkward to build around. They were using one of the strongest sacred forms available to them. It is difficult to imagine a clearer declaration that the city's core logic involved passage between levels of existence. Above and below, human and divine, present settlement and primordial beginning. Once you accept that possibility, the pyramid feels less like a monument placed on the landscape and more like a device for turning sacred geography into public architecture. It also helps explain something else that might otherwise seem strange. Why make one of the largest structures in the Americas at that time over something that most people would never fully see? If the point were simply spectacle, an open summit shrine or a freestanding platform would already do a good deal of work. But a hidden cave changes the nature of the spectacle. It means the visible mass refers to an invisible centre. The building tells the population that what matters most is not always on display. That is a useful lesson in a city built around ceremony. Public ritual can happen on stairways and terraces, but its authority deepens if people believe the structure rises from a deeper source, one hidden beneath the floor of the world. The Sun Pyramid then becomes both a mountain and a lid, both revelation and covering. It shows power, but it also conceals its sacred anchor. Modern archaeology has the frustrating privilege of discovering exactly those hidden anchors centuries later, and then having to admit, in the most professional possible language, that this makes everything both clearer and more mysterious. There is another layer to this, and it comes from how the pyramid fits into the city rather than standing alone. The Met notes that the pyramids of the Sun and the Moon served as focal points for Teotihuacan's urban layout, and UNESCO describes the ceremonial ensemble as arranged with a strictness based on cosmic harmony. Smart History adds that the Pyramid of the Sun was meant to be viewed and approached from the east. In other words, this was not simply a mountain-shaped object dropped into the middle of town. It was integrated into movement, sightlines, and city planning. You approached it in a certain way. You saw it at certain moments in relation to the Avenue of the Dead. You experienced it as part of a large sequence of monuments that organized the ceremonial core. If the cave beneath it was indeed one reason for the structure's placement, then the city plan was not just respecting sacred geography, it was amplifying it. The avenue, the orientation, the processional movement, and the enormous rise of the pyramid all work together to convert an underground sacred feature into the most visible mass in the city. That is careful thinking. It means the builders knew exactly how to take something hidden and give it public force without giving away all of its mystery. The Pyramid of the Moon clarifies this logic by approaching it from the opposite direction. The Moon Pyramid stands at the northern end of the Avenue of the Dead, and both Smart History and the Met emphasize its relationship to Cerro Gordo, the mountain rising behind it. Smart History says visitors can still see the extinct volcano framing the pyramid and describes this as a demonstration of the harmonious relationship between architecture and natural topography. The Met's older essay says the pyramids of the Sun and Moon echo the shapes of the mountains surrounding the valley and served as focal points for the city's layout. That means Teotihuacan's two greatest monuments were each tied to a different form of sacred geography. One covered a cave, the other answered a mountain, one dealt with the underworld and emergence beneath the surface. The other stood in dialogue with a looming natural height at the edge of the urban plan. Together they make the city look less like a collection of structures and more like a system built to connect vertical worlds. Below ground, ground level, raised platform, distant summit and sky. That is not decorative symbolism. That is a city teaching people where they stood in a layered universe, and the phrase, "the mountain beneath it," begins to work in two directions at once. On one level, the Pyramid of the Sun is itself an artificial mountain raised over a cave, which means the mountain above is almost answering the void below. On another level, the Moon Pyramid stands before Cerro Gordo so effectively that the natural mountain seems to continue through the built one. The city, then, does not choose between nature and architecture, it makes them collaborate. UNESCO says the urban design integrated natural elements of the valley, and the altered course of the San Juan River shows the same principle in another register. Teotihuacan did not treat landscape as passive scenery. It treated landscape as material for meaning. Mountains were echoed, watercourses were redirected, caves were monumentalized. The result is a sacred topography made legible through construction. That is one reason the city still feels strangely complete, even in ruin. The plan did not only organize buildings, it organized relationships between buildings and powers already present in the land. When a civilization does that successfully, later people do not just admire the engineering, they feel that the place is charged. This also brings us closer to the question of preparation. A society does not commit itself to such a massive architectural language unless it believes these relationships matter continuously. If caves are associated with origin, fertility, and the underworld, and mountains are associated with looming natural power, visibility, and perhaps sacred presence, then binding both into the city's plans suggests an effort to stabilize the terms on which the human world operates. You can almost imagine the logic as practical, even if the beliefs themselves are sacred. If life comes from below, if rain and seasons depend on cosmic balance, if mountains and caves are entrances, sources, or anchors, then the city ought to be built where those things can be marked, approached, and managed through ritual. The Pyramid of the Sun over the cave becomes not just a monument to beginnings, but a way of keeping beginnings accessible. The Moon Pyramid, before Cerro Gordo, becomes not just a scenic arrangement, but a controlled civic version of a mountain relationship that might otherwise belong only to the raw landscape. Teotihuacan is taking unstable powers and giving them addresses. There is a useful discipline in not rushing too far ahead here. We do not have a surviving Teotihuacan text saying, "We built this pyramid over this cave because here is our exact doctrinal explanation." Archaeology almost never rewards us with that kind of tidy confession. The more cautious sources keep using words like may have, perhaps, and suggested, and that caution is healthy. The Met says the cave may have been a place of emergence and may have influenced the alignment and construction of the pyramid. Smart History says it is unclear who or what the pyramid commemorated, though creation mythology has been proposed. Even the more technical excavation reports emphasize that many uncertainties about the function, meaning chronology and use of the monument, remain unresolved. That uncertainty should not weaken the story, it should sharpen it. Because what we do know is already remarkable enough. There was a cave. The largest pyramid in the city rose over it. Caves held deep symbolic force in Mesoamerican thought. The monument was central to the city's layout. The Moon Pyramid answered the shape of Cerro Gordo. None of that is accidental, even if the final theology stays just beyond reach. What makes this especially powerful is that the underground and the monumental were not sealed off from ritual life. The Met says the cave beneath the Pyramid of the Sun appears to have been the scene of numerous ancient fire and water rituals. That detail is easy to underestimate, but it is extremely revealing. Fire and water are not random ritual materials. They are elemental, oppositional, generative, destructive, and useful in nearly every symbolic system built around life, fertility, and transformation. A cave that hosted fire and water rites was not a forgotten foundation cavity. It remained active in sacred imagination. The hidden center had to be worked on, addressed, and perhaps fed. Once again, the city begins to look less like a place built to celebrate what already existed, and more like a place built to keep certain conditions functioning. That is a subtle but important difference. Celebration can be occasional, maintenance cannot. If the cave mattered enough to shape the monument and host ritual attention, then the city's greatest mass may have stood over an active point of contact, something closer to a sacred mechanism than a mere memory of origins. The Moon Pyramid adds its own version of this seriousness. The Met notes that excavations near the base of its staircase uncovered a significant tomb containing a male skeleton, grave goods of obsidian and greenstone, and sacrificial animals, while it also suggests that more important tombs may lie deeper within the structure. We should be careful not to overstate what has and has not been found, but even this much indicates that the Northern Pyramid was not simply a scenic endpoint for the avenue. It was a place where offerings, death, and monumental construction intersected. The relationship to Cerro Gordo already made it visually powerful. Evidence of important burial activity adds another dimension. The city's mountain-facing pyramid was also a place where selected bodies and objects were placed inside the architecture itself. That begins to look very much like another version of preparation. Not only are mountains echoed and caves monumentalized, but people and offerings are inserted into the fabric of these structures as though the buildings are not complete until something living, costly, or symbolically potent has been placed within them. This is one reason Teotihuacan can feel so controlled and so uneasy at the same time. The architecture is stable. The meanings behind it suggest a world that is not automatically stable. A cave of origin sits beneath the largest pyramid. A mountain frames the northern one. Rituals of fire and water take place in hidden chambers. Burials and sacrificial deposits enter monumental structures. The avenue draws people past these arranged thresholds, in a sequence the city seems to have considered important. Put all of that together and the place starts to feel less like a simple capital, and more like an enormous effort to keep several dangerous relationships in good order. Above and below, life and death, city and landscape, human action and cosmic continuation. That does not mean the residents of Teotihuacan went about their days in constant theatrical panic, clutching offerings every time the weather looked inconvenient. It means the people who built and managed the city likely thought certain foundations of life required active, visible, and repeated care. The pyramids were where that care was made undeniable, and if that is true, then the next step in the story follows almost on its own. Once a civilization starts building mountains over caves, aligning monuments with natural peaks, and placing valuable things inside the architecture, you begin to realize the city was not only arranged on the surface, it was charged from within. The stones were one part of the message, the things hidden under them were another, and that is where the question of preparation becomes even harder to ignore. If the pyramids and avenues of Teotihuacan were the part of the city people could see, the offerings were the part meant to go on working when nobody was looking. That is the simplest way to approach them. Modern visitors naturally focus on surfaces, because surfaces are what survive in the most obvious way. Staircases, facades, platforms, broad processional routes, mountain views, all of that announces itself. But Teotihuacan repeatedly invested some of its most valuable materials and some of its most serious rituals into places that were meant to be sealed up. That is the detail that changes the mood of the whole city. These were not objects placed for display in a palace hall, where elites could admire them over dinner and discuss how well the decorators had done. They were buried inside foundations, hidden in monumental enlargements, pushed into tunnels, placed beneath temple floors, and committed to darkness. At the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, the National Institute of Anthropology and History states directly that offerings were registered in the temple foundations and that they contained mainly human remains, dedicated either to the construction of the building or to the deity. At the Moon Pyramid, a major study in ancient Mesoamerica describes a series of highly elaborated burial and offering complexes associated with successive monumental construction phases, containing obsidian, greenstone, shell, pyrite, ceramics, wood, textiles, and the remains of sacrificed humans and animals. The language of the archaeology is careful, but the pattern is not subtle. New building phase, new deposit, new enlargement, new burial, new architecture, new hidden payment. That is why offerings buried for an unseen future is not just a dramatic phrase. It is a good description of what Teotihuacan seems to have been doing. The Cambridge report on the Moon Pyramid concludes that these deposits functioned as symbols of state religious ideology and communicated socio-political information on behalf of ruling elites, and that the most important ritual paraphernalia was buried in the monument's enlargement programs to express sacred rulership. The PLOS study of Teotihuacan faunal remains sharpens that point by noting that each offering it examined was built in dedication to a new building phase. That means the offerings were not random accumulations from centuries of messy use. They were part of construction itself. They entered the monument at the moment the monument was becoming more monument. The hidden deposit was not an afterthought. It was one of the conditions of completion. If you wanted the new structure to stand properly in religious and political terms, something had to be placed inside it first. That is one of the clearest signs anywhere in Teotihuacan that building was not just engineering. It was a transaction. The city kept making agreements with powers that were not expected to sign paperwork. The Moon Pyramid is one of the best places to see this logic in action, because the evidence there is both repeated and unusually rich. The Cambridge report describes 7 superimposed monumental constructions at the Moon Pyramid and 5 major burial or offering complexes discovered in association with them. The deposits included not only high-value materials, but also sacrificed humans and animals, many with strong associations to warfare and ritual power. The Metropolitan Museum summarizes the same pattern in simpler terms, noting that excavations at the Moon Pyramid have documented pumas, eagles, serpents, and other predators buried as part of its dedicatory programs, along with greenstone beads, obsidian blades, and ceremonial mirrors. Once you line those details up, the basic picture becomes hard to ignore. As the monument grew, its interior was charged repeatedly with substances and bodies selected for force, rarity, danger, and symbolic weight. This is not how a society behaves when it thinks a building is merely an elevated platform for gatherings. It is how a society behaves when it thinks architecture must be made active from within. A stairway can be seen, a platform can be climbed, but a buried puma, a cache of blades, or a mirror sealed into a construction episode is doing something else. It is meant to remain there, working in silence. The animal evidence is especially revealing because it is too specific to dismiss as decorative symbolism. The PLOS study found that the Moon Pyramid and one Sun Pyramid cache contained selected apex predators: golden eagles in the sky category, pumas, jaguars, and wolves on land, and rattlesnakes as creatures of a liminal zone. The authors argue that agents of the Teotihuacan state deliberately selected these animals as core emblems appropriate for state offerings, and note that they were regarded as major symbols of power and rulership in Mesoamerica. The same study also found signs that at least some of these creatures had been managed in captivity. Several eagles showed pathologies consistent with captive stress, and isotope evidence suggested that some carnivores had been fed controlled diets before sacrifice. In 2 pumas, the researchers concluded that the animals were most likely raised on lagomorphs, supplemented with dog and possibly human meat. That is an extraordinary level of preparation. It means the offerings were not simply collections of powerful species gathered at the last minute, because someone in authority had suddenly decided the dedication ceremony should look more impressive. At least some ritual victims had to be managed over time, fed over time, maintained over time, and then placed where the building phase required them. The future was being provisioned in advance, often with living beings held specifically for that purpose. Once you understand that, the offerings start to look less like gifts in the casual sense and more like installations of power. We tend to use the word offering gently, as though it refers to a basket of fruit, a few flowers, or at worst a tasteful ceramic bowl placed with decent intentions. Teotihuacan had a much more robust understanding of the category. At the Moon Pyramid, the deposits could include sacrificed humans, wild carnivores, birds of prey, serpents, mirrors, blades, shell, greenstone, and pyrite. At the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, the Met reports that an estimated 200 to 260 individuals were sacrificed before construction began, with 137 archaeologically documented, and that their burial was accompanied by an unprecedented quantity and diversity of precious goods, including jade and greenstone sculptures, obsidian blades, fine ceramics, rubber balls, hematite mirrors, seeds, plants, and seashells. The scale alone matters. A few hidden valuables would still be significant. Hundreds of sacrificed people and large deposits of imported and symbolically loaded materials suggest something closer to foundational theatre, carried out for an audience beyond the human crowd. These were deposits meant to bind a structure to warfare, rulership, fertility, distant places, and divine legitimacy all at once. That is a serious opening investment for a building. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent pushes this even further because the deposits there seem designed to say not only that sacrifice mattered, but that the city could mobilize sacrifice and wealth on a regional scale. The Met notes that oxygen isotope analyses indicate the human sacrifices deposited beneath the pyramid originated in several distinct regions of Mesoamerica, although many had lived in Teotihuacan long enough for their bones to reflect adaptation to the local diet. That detail is unsettling in a very particular way. It suggests a ritual program that was not simply plucking strangers from a passing road and throwing them under a temple in a moment of local enthusiasm. The people interred there were, in many cases, connected to the city before death. They had been absorbed into its life long enough to become part of its dietary signature, and then they were absorbed again into its sacred foundations. Meanwhile, the goods placed with them included shells from distant coasts, greenstones and jade, mirrors, fine ceramics, seeds, plants, and rubber balls. The Feathered Serpent Pyramid was not only being built with stone and labour, it was being loaded with geography. Coast, highland, trade route, warfare, agriculture, ritual spectacle, all of it was compressed into a hidden founding deposit. If a city wants to present itself as the centre of a world, this is one way to do it. You place pieces of many worlds under one structure and let the building claim them permanently. There's also something important in the fact that many of these deposits were never meant for ordinary residents to inspect. Public ritual at Teotihuacan was spectacular enough. The Great Avenue, the stairways, the facades, the plazas, and the painted architecture already took care of that side of things. The offerings underground belonged to another logic. They were not there to produce admiration from the neighbourhood. They were there because visibility was not the point. Efficacy was the point. The radiocarbon study on the tunnel beneath the Feathered Serpent Pyramid is especially useful here because it says every closure of the tunnel was accompanied by a deliberate and structured deposition of offerings and ritual refuse along the passage. The tunnel had been intentionally sealed with large boulders nearly 2,000 years ago, according to Smithsonian's reporting on its discovery, and Reuters later reported that more than 100,000 artifacts had been catalogued from the sealed tunnel, all part of ceremonial offerings distributed along a roughly 100-metre corridor ending in 3 chambers under the pyramid's midpoint. That is not decorative burial. That is a hidden program of placement, closure, and continued meaning. When a society seals offerings into a passage and then closes the passage itself, it is preparing something to endure out of sight. It is acting on the assumption that concealment does not cancel power. In some cases, it may complete it. And the tunnel under the Feathered Serpent Pyramid complicates the story in the best way, because it shows that Teotihuacan did not bury only bodies and precious objects in foundations. It also buried sequences. The radiocarbon article dates the tunnel materials to a span broadly from about AD 125 to 240 for the main ceremonial activity, with materials at the end chamber yielding dates between AD 400 and 534. The authors propose a chronology of construction phases, ceremonial use, and partial and definitive closures, each closure accompanied by deliberate offerings. That means the hidden world under the pyramid was not a one-time deposit forgotten after the dedication banquet ended, and everyone went home trying not to step on ceremonial hems. It was revisited, managed, added to, and eventually closed in stages. Reuters describes the finds as ranging from statues, jewellery, shells, and ceramics to thousands of wooden and metallic objects, while the article notes that they were carefully placed there by priests roughly 2,000 years ago. What emerges from that is a picture of concealed ritual, not as a single founding act, but as a long conversation. The city kept returning to the underground, placing more into it, structuring its endings as carefully as its beginnings. That is exactly what you would expect if the hidden deposits were meant to shape the future and not merely commemorate the past. This is also where the phrase unseen future becomes useful in a more literal way. A foundation offering is future-oriented almost by definition. Once it is buried, it exists for what comes next. It does not help the people who placed it in any ordinary practical sense. They cannot admire it daily, they cannot trade it, they cannot pass it around after the ceremony and say what a nice mirror that was before it vanished under 70 tons of stone. The object is sacrificed from the human economy and moved into another one. The same is true on a much grimmer scale for human and animal victims placed within the monument. These are irreversible acts, and irreversibility matters because it turns the deposit into a commitment. A society only does this repeatedly if it believes the buried content will keep doing necessary work after the witnesses have gone home. The Cambridge Moon Pyramid study's conclusion that these deposits express sacred rulership is one part of that. Another part, which is an inference from the placement and repetition, is that Teotihuacan was building monuments that had to remain ritually alive into the future. They were not complete when the plaster dried. They were complete when something costly had been entrusted to the dark. It is worth pausing over how broad the category of costly was in this city. Cost did not only mean rare stone or imported shell. Cost could mean labour spent managing dangerous animals. It could mean the long-distance movement of exotic materials. It could mean the training, feeding and retention of people within a ritual system. It could mean human life itself. The Met Ciudadela essay describes the feathered serpent pyramid offerings as an unprecedented quantity and diversity of precious goods. The PLOS animal study suggests deliberate selection of apex predators as state emblems. The Cambridge report on the Moon Pyramid emphasises the richness of obsidian, greenstone, shell, pyrite, wood, textiles and sacrificed remains. Taken together, that tells us something very plain about Teotihuacan's priorities. The city's builders and rulers were willing to remove some of their most symbolically powerful resources from circulation and put them where no one would routinely see them. That is a major decision for any political system. It implies confidence, yes, but also need. You do not keep paying that price unless you think the return matters. The return may have been legitimacy, cosmic order, political authority, agricultural stability, divine favour, or some combination of all four. Whatever the formula, the act makes sense only if the future was believed to depend on hidden foundations being properly provisioned. There is also an emotional difference between a memorial deposit and a future-making deposit, and Teotihuacan seems to lean hard toward the second. A memorial deposit says, in effect, remember this. A future-making deposit says, continue from this. The distinction is subtle, but it matters. The hidden caches under new building faces at the Moon Pyramid were tied to enlargement programs. The foundation offerings under the Feathered Serpent Pyramid were tied to the birth of the building. The tunnel offerings under the Feathered Serpent were structured around use and closure over time. The cave beneath the Pyramid of the Sun hosted ancient fire and water rituals according to the Met. Across the city, then, hidden places were not simply archives of what had happened. They were active nodes in what still needed to happen. The underworld was not only remembered, it was serviced. The building was not only inaugurated, it was equipped. The seal tunnel was not simply shut, it was composed into silence with offerings along the way. That makes Teotihuacan sound almost like a city that distrusted bare surfaces, a city that wanted its most important architecture backed by invisible reserves of force. And that may be the most useful way to think about these deposits if we are trying to answer what the people of Teotihuacan were preparing for. They were preparing at the very least for continuation under uncertainty. That is an inference, but it is a grounded one. The archaeology shows repeated dedicatory deposits linked to construction phases, costly offerings hidden inside major monuments, structured closures of sacred underground space, and a city willing to bury war symbols, predators, mirrors, imported goods, seeds, and human beings beneath the architecture that organized public life. A society does not do that because it thinks tomorrow will take care of itself. It does it because tomorrow needs help. Maybe that help was imagined in terms of cosmic balance. Maybe it was framed as sacred rulership. Maybe it was tied to fertility, seasonal return, dynastic authority, or all of these at once. But the offerings themselves keep saying the same thing. The future was not expected to arrive empty-handed. It had to be met, supplied, and in some sense secured. Teotihuacan buried its confidence where nobody could applaud it. That is one reason the city still feels so controlled and so uneasy at once. By this point, the city no longer looks like a place that simply honoured gods when convenient or gathered crowds for occasional spectacle. It looks like a machine that accepted inputs. Bodies, animals, blades, mirrors, seeds, shells, stone, time, and labour went in. Authority, order, and continuity were expected to come out. That does not make Teotihuacan simple. If anything, it makes it hard to reduce. The same deposit might speak to warfare, fertility, rulership, regional reach, underworld power, and the legitimacy of the state all at once. But one thing does become clearer. These buried offerings were not ornaments for the dead past. They were provisions for a city that believed its own survival depended on managing forces larger than everyday life. And once you see that, the next part of the puzzle comes into focus almost by itself, because hidden deposits alone cannot keep a city running. Someone still has to organize the material world above them. The obsidian, the water, the labor, the resources, and the political power that made all this burying possible in the first place. By this point, the city has already shown us what it liked to hide. Offerings went into the dark, tunnels were sealed with intention, and the largest monuments stood over places that mattered precisely because they were not ordinary. But hidden foundations by themselves do not explain how a city on this scale functioned day after day. A population that may have reached 125,000 to 200,000 people could not live on sacred atmosphere alone. Teotihuacan needed materials, labour, routes of supply, controlled water, places to make things, places to move them, and institutions strong enough to keep all of that from dissolving into confusion. The ceremonial centre was the face of power, but obsidian and water were much closer to its hands. They were the things power could grip. They were practical, measurable, indispensable, and in Teotihuacan they were never merely practical. They were bound up with trade, warfare, ritual, and the ordering of the city itself. When you put them together, the place begins to look less like a collection of sacred buildings and more like a machine whose moving parts happen to be made of stone, canals, workshops, markets, and disciplined human effort. Start with obsidian, because in ancient Mesoamerica, obsidian was not a luxury at the edge of life. It was part of life. It cut better than many available alternatives. It could be shaped into blades, dart points, scrapers, knives, and ritual objects, and it moved easily from household use into state display. Britannica's survey of the early classic says obsidian was probably Teotihuacan's preeminent commercial specialization. It adds that the Teotihuacanos had gained control of the mines of green obsidian near present-day Pachuca in Hidalgo. while also using a local but poorer quality source, and that millions of blades, knives, dart points and scrapers were produced in workshops for export. That is a remarkable combination of facts. It means the city controlled an especially valued raw material, processed it on a very large scale, and pushed finished goods outward across Mesoamerica. A place that can do that is not simply participating in exchange, it is structuring it. Obsidian was useful in the ordinary sense, but in Teotihuacan it was also one of the clearest ways the city turned geology into authority. The scale of production matters because it tells us this was not the occasional work of a few gifted knappers, quietly turning out elegant pieces in spare moments between neighbourhood gossip and routine household repairs. Scholarly work on Teotihuacan's obsidian industry describes a large number of workshops across the city. A Cambridge abstract on a confirmed workshop in the Telajinga district states that the Teotihuacan mapping project identified many obsidian workshops from surface debris, and the excavation at Compound 17 confirmed it as a locus of large-scale obsidian craft production during the Classic period. Another Cambridge source, summarising the older but still foundational work of Michael Spence, states that obsidian production was a major component of the city's economy, with hundreds of workshops producing cores and blades of green obsidian and bifaces of grey obsidian for distribution throughout central Mexico. It also notes something especially useful for understanding power. Green obsidian seems to have been obtained through a state network, while grey obsidian procurement was conducted independently by many workshop groups. That is the sort of mixed arrangement real states often prefer. Total monopoly is not always necessary if the most symbolically charged and politically useful material is the one most directly controlled. That distinction between green and grey obsidian helps the city come into focus. Not all sharp stone was equal. Green Pachuca obsidian was visually distinctive and evidently important enough to travel through a state-connected supply system. Grey obsidian could circulate more independently. So even inside one material category, Teotihuacan may have been grading value, access and control. This would fit the broader pattern we have already seen, a city that liked order, hierarchy and selective access. The same Metropolitan Museum essay that describes the city's residential compounds also notes the recovery of specialised craft goods such as worked obsidian, and says imported foreign goods were critical to the city's economy. It further suggests that the Great Compound may have functioned as a centralised market, while the Street of the Dead complex may have served as an elite administrative centre. Taken together, those clues point to an urban economy in which production, exchange, and oversight were spatially close to the ceremonial core, rather than hidden in some irrelevant industrial fringe. The city's political centre and its material circulation were neighbours, which is usually what happens when rulers prefer not to lose sight of what actually keeps them powerful. Obsidian also matters because it was never only commercial. It sat directly inside Teotihuacan's ritual and military language. The Metropolitan Museum notes that rich offerings of jade, obsidian, rubber, and shell have been documented at each of the city's 3 major temple platforms. A Cambridge abstract on implements of state power goes further and argues that Teotihuacan leaders pursued expansionary strategies through the large-scale manufacture of weaponry and ceremonial items tied to themes of warfare and sacrifice. It specifically says that excavations at the Moon Pyramid show obsidian being reduced into dart points and eccentric forms linked to militarism and sacrificial practice in the city's art and archaeology. That is a very important pairing. The same material could become a household blade, an exported tool, a weapon, and a ritual implement. In that sense, obsidian was almost perfect for Teotihuacan. It connected daily necessity to state violence and sacred offering without ever-changing substance. The city did not need separate worlds for labour, war, and religion. One of its favourite materials already moved among all 3. The residential pattern of the city reinforces that point. The Met describes between 2,000 and 2,300 apartment compounds, housing about 85% of the population, with perhaps 60 to 100 individuals in each compound. It also notes that craft specialization may have shaped who lived together. That means large parts of the city's productive economy were probably embedded in residential life, rather than sealed off from it. Workshops sat inside the social fabric. Skilled groups lived and worked in compounds that were at once domestic, economic, and probably corporate in structure. Teotihuacan's power, then, did not only depend on a few monumental places at the centre, it depended on thousands of repeated units where labour, storage, kinship and skilled production could be organised in durable ways. This is one of the reasons the city appears so stable for so long. It built order into both the grand scale and the ordinary one. A state that wants obsidian in large quantities does not simply need mines and traders. It needs neighbourhoods capable of absorbing production into daily routine without ceasing to be neighbourhoods. Water reveals the same logic from another angle, except here the city's control had to be exercised over movement rather than extraction. UNESCO notes that Teotihuacan's urban plan integrated natural elements of the valley, and that the course of the San Juan River was altered so it could cross the Avenue of the Dead. That statement is brief, but it is one of the most revealing facts we have. A city does not reroute a river because it enjoys extra paperwork. It does so because the landscape must be made to fit the plan. The water chapter by Evans and Nichols says Teotihuacanos controlled the flow of water through their urban domain with a blend of practical engineering and nuanced sacred meaning, and that their formal hydrological system developed alongside monumental and residential building programs. This is exactly the kind of evidence that keeps Teotihuacan from being reduced to beautiful ruins. The city was an engineering project as much as a ceremonial one. Water had to be handled, directed, stored, displayed, and incorporated into urban order. In a settlement of this size, that is not background maintenance. That is government in physical form. The details of that engineering make the point even more strongly. The same water study says that rerouting and canalization of the San Juan River likely took place in the 2nd century CE, involving nearly 2 miles of canalized river course conformed to the city's grid and sacred orientation, plus additional straight canals running upslope and down toward the spring line. It adds that other watercourses, including the San Lorenzo River, barrancas, and smaller streams, were also rerouted to fit the urban grid, and that the city built an organised drainage system to manage flooding, including around the Pyramid of the Sun. The authors also mention reservoirs behind the Ciudadela and elsewhere to collect water for the dry season and control runoff. This is a very substantial hydraulic program. It required planning, labour coordination, surveying, maintenance, and a level of authority capable of telling water where the city preferred it to go. Once again, the visible monument is only half the story. The rest lies in the controlled movement of things most people cannot admire for long without getting wet or very tired. What makes this especially Teotihuacan, rather than merely competent civil engineering, is that the waterworks were also tied to sacred imagery and political theatre. Evans and Nichols argue that the canalized San Juan River was essential to the development and iconographic message of the southern complex. They say visitors approaching from the west or southwest would travel on or beside the river canal's arrow-straight course, visually associated with the water-themed tiers of the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. They also note that runoff was tamed into a system of orthogonal canals and drains, and that the Feathered Serpent cult likely stood under the patronage of flowing water as well as rain. In other words, the canal was not only practical infrastructure, it was part of what visitors experienced as they approached one of the most politically charged zones in the city. The rulers of Teotihuacan, or whatever governing body held power there, did not merely manage water. They staged their management of water. They turned control over flow into part of the city's public message. That is a classic move of strong states. First solve a practical problem, then make the solution look inevitable, sacred, and inseparable from your right to rule. The same study adds another useful dimension. when it notes that canalizing the river connected the southern complex with Lake Texcoco, at least seasonally, and could have improved access to the city for provisioning trade, diplomatic missions and pilgrimages. It also says the southern complex served the interests of merchants, not only devotees of the feathered serpent cult. That is exactly the kind of overlap that keeps appearing at Teotihuacan. Religion is not in one box, commerce in another, and infrastructure in a third. They meet in the same spaces. A canal can direct runoff, enhance movement of goods, frame the approach to a major temple, and reinforce the prestige of a cult all at once. A market can be near a ceremonial complex. Imported goods can feed both domestic consumption and sacred offering. Obsidian can move from workshop to exchange to temple deposit to weapon. The city's machinery of power worked precisely because these systems reinforced each other instead of operating as separate departments with passive-aggressive memoranda and occasional scheduling conflicts. Seen this way, Teotihuacan's grandeur begins to look more demanding than mysterious. It still has mystery, certainly, but much of that mystery sits on top of very concrete accomplishments. Someone had to organise quarrying and transport. Someone had to keep workshops productive. Someone had to arrange supply from Pachuca's green obsidian source. Someone had to direct riverworks, drains and reservoirs. Someone had to integrate those systems into a city grid where the monumental centre, residential compounds, possible market and administrative zones all worked in relation to each other. The city covered about 36 square kilometres at its peak, according to UNESCO, and only about a tenth of that was the ceremonial core. The rest had to function too. When we speak of Teotihuacan's power then, we should picture more than rulers on platforms or priests before temple facades. We should also picture crews in canals, craft specialists in compounds, merchants moving stackable goods, and officials who understood that authority survives when materials and water arrive where they are supposed to. This does not make the city less impressive, it makes it more so. Monumental religion is easier to admire than drainage, but drainage is what keeps large cities alive long enough to have monumental religion in the first place. Fine obsidian blades are easier to display than workshop debris, but workshop debris is where the evidence of sustained production sits. Teotihuacan's rulers, factions or collective governing institutions, however exactly we describe them, seem to have understood this very well. The city's material power came from the ability to transform raw resources into organised flows. Stone became tools, weapons, and ritual objects. Water became canals, controlled approaches, stored reserves, and statements of sacred order. Urban space became a framework that linked production, residence, ceremony, and exchange. That is why the city could look so composed from a distance. Composition was not an aesthetic extra. It was part of how practical systems were made legible, persuasive, and durable. And once you begin to see Teotihuacan in that practical light, another feature of the city becomes much easier to understand. A place with this many workshops, this much trade, this much hydraulic intervention, and this much demand for specialised labour was never likely to be made up of one simple, locally rooted population. Cities that build on this scale tend to pull people toward them, sometimes willingly, sometimes strategically, sometimes because opportunity and authority have a way of appearing in the same place. Teotihuacan's machinery of power did not run on stone and water alone. It also ran on human variety, on neighbourhoods, migrants, traders, and communities that arrived from elsewhere and found themselves living inside the grid. A city on this scale does not stay one thing for very long. Once Teotihuacan had the roads, the compounds, the markets, the workshops, the canals, and the obsidian moving through its hands, it was never going to remain a settlement of one neatly bounded people all thinking the same thoughts and cooking the same meals behind identical walls. Large cities do not work that way now, and they did not work that way then. They attract specialists, traders, pilgrims, labourers, ambitious families, displaced communities, political guests, reluctant dependence, and people who arrive for reasons nobody bothers to write down because survival rarely comes with a formal archive. In Teotihuacan's case, archaeologists increasingly describe it in exactly those terms, not simply as a very large city, but as a multi-ethnic one. The Metropolitan Museum calls it a place that developed relations with the Zapotec of Monte Alban and interacted with major Maya capitals, while recent migration research describes it as a major multi-ethnic urban centre that attracted migrants from as far away as West Mexico and the Maya region. A P@NAS summary pushes the point even further by describing Teotihuacan as a complex multi-ethnic settlement from early on, one that originally accommodated populations displaced by volcanic eruptions in the southern basin of Mexico. That is an important shift in perspective. Teotihuacan was not just a city that later became cosmopolitan because success made it fashionable. Diversity may have been built into its life almost from the beginning. That changes the feel of the place considerably. It means the city's order was not imposed on a single, tidy social block. It was imposed, negotiated, and lived across populations with different origins, different habits, and different ties to places outside the valley. The old image of Teotihuacan as a kind of monolithic machine starts to soften once you realise how many people inside it were not born there, or were born there in communities determined to preserve identities that began elsewhere. The evidence for that no longer rests on a few exotic pots and some hopeful scholarly enthusiasm. It comes from multiple lines of research: burial practice, neighbourhood archaeology, imported goods, architectural variation, isotopes, and genetics. In the Tlajinga district, a dual isotope study concluded that migrants comprised about 45% of the population sampled in 3 apartment compounds, with immigration especially high in the first centuries of compound occupation, but continuing throughout the district's history. At Teopan Casco, genetic work found diversity consistent with a multi-ethnic neighbourhood centre, and concluded that this diversity was present from the beginning, and lasted until the neighbourhood's collapse. When that sort of evidence starts appearing in more than one part of the city, the old question stops being whether foreigners were present and becomes how Teotihuacan managed so many kinds of belonging at once. One answer is that the city did not merely absorb migrants and blur them into a single anonymous mass. In some places it seems to have allowed, or perhaps encouraged, distinct communities to maintain themselves in recognisable ways. The clearest example is the Oaxaca barrio, known as Teotihuacan, which yielded important evidence for Oaxacan peoples living in the metropolis. The Colorado volume on Teotihuacan and early classic Mesoamerica identifies Teotihuacan as the Oaxaca barrio and describes it as a key case for understanding contacts with Monte Alban. Meanwhile, stable oxygen isotope research on the enclave concluded that there was continual interaction among its inhabitants, their Oaxacan homeland, and other diaspora colonies. That is a wonderful phrase, continual interaction, because it prevents us from imagining migration as a one-time severing. The people of Teotihuacan did not simply arrive, shut the door behind them, and forget where they came from. The isotopic evidence suggests movement, contact, and ongoing ties. In other words, Teotihuacan was not only a place where people from elsewhere lived, it was a place where distance itself had to be managed, remembered, and perhaps deliberately sustained. The city contained neighbourhoods whose residents were local in residence, and not entirely local in orientation, which is a very modern-sounding condition for a place nearly 2,000 years old. That Oaxaca connection mattered enough to leave traces beyond the city as well. The same Colorado source notes that monuments from Monte Alban record the arrival of Teotihuacanos at the Zapotec capital, and it describes relations between Teotihuacan and Monte Alban as having long been considered a special relationship, even if scholars still debate whether that relationship was alliance, control, selective contact, or something more uneven and complicated. The details of that argument do not need to be settled here to see what matters for the city itself. Teotihuacan was part of a living network in which people, symbols, and political ties moved both outward and inward. The Oaxaca barrio was not an isolated curiosity tucked away like a museum display of multiculturalism before lunch. It was part of a broader pattern of interaction linking one great centre to another. That means residents of Tlailotlacan were not only preserving memory, they were likely helping mediate real exchanges between cities. A neighbourhood could be both a home and a corridor. That possibility fits very well with what we have already seen in Teotihuacan. Practical systems and sacred systems overlapping until it becomes hard to say where one ends and the other begins. A city that binds mountains, caves, canals and offerings into one structure of meaning is perfectly capable of turning migrant communities into part of its machinery as well. Another district seems to have done something similar from a different direction. The Merchants' Barrio on the city's eastern side is described in the same Colorado volume as an enclave of Gulf Coast peoples. The text adds that some of the largest concentrations of imported Maya pottery are found there, suggesting that interaction among Teotihuacan, the Gulf Coast and the Maya region was more complex than a simple line from imperial centre to passive periphery. A separate story map on the Merchants' Barrio notes unusual circular residential structures there, along with foreign pottery and artefacts associated with the Gulf Coast. Even allowing for the lighter format of that source, the pattern is clear enough. This was a neighbourhood with material habits that stood out. It looked different. It housed people tied to exchange routes leading eastward. It may have played a mediating role in long-distance contacts that later scholarship still struggles to map neatly. If the Oaxaca Barrio tells us one kind of foreign presence could stay cohesive over time, the Merchants' Barrio suggests another kind of community, one tied to movement, trade, and the handling of distant connections. Teotihuacan was not simply taking goods from afar, it was housing the human systems that made faraway goods intelligible and reliable. That makes the city feel less like a sealed capital and more like a magnet with neighbourhoods arranged around different trajectories of movement. Scholars have also pointed to other possible enclaves and affiliations. The Colorado introduction mentions that relations with the Maya were multi-directional, and says evidence from Tetitla has been used to argue for the presence of literate Maya living in one apartment compound. A recent Cambridge abstract on Site 19:N1W5 near Tlailotlacan reports evidence of both Tlailotlacan and Michoacan affiliation. Even if every proposed enclave is not equally well understood, the cumulative impression is unmistakable. Teotihuacan had room for identifiable communities tied to Oaxaca, the Gulf Coast, perhaps Michoacan, perhaps the Maya world, and certainly nearby regions feeding migration into compounds and neighbourhood centres. The city's population was not just large, it was layered. Some residents likely came with merchants, some came through marriage, some arrived as specialists, some may have been absorbed through political relationships that were unequal from the beginning. Some were probably second or third generation descendants of people who had moved earlier, growing up inside compounds where the memory of another homeland remained alive in food, burial custom, language, and daily routine. Teopan Casco is especially useful here because it shows how complicated a single neighbourhood could become. Genetic and isotopic work there concluded that the population was composed of three broad groups: people from Teotihuacan itself, people from nearby regions such as Tlaxcala, Hidalgo, and Puebla, and people from farther away, including the coastal plains. The same study found a level of genetic diversity consistent with the multi-ethnic character of the neighbourhood and a close genetic relationship with populations from the Teotihuacan corridor, Oaxaca, and the Maya region. A PNAS summary of the site likewise describes cooperation and tensions in a multi-ethnic corporate society and highlights the presence of multiple groups within Teopan Casco. This matters because it moves us beyond the simple image of one enclave for one outside people. Teotihuacan was capable of neighbourhoods where several streams of origin overlapped. Not every district was a neatly labelled foreign quarter. Some were more like negotiated social engines, places where locals, near migrants and far migrants lived close enough to cooperate, exchange, intermarry, compete, and occasionally make each other's lives difficult in ways the archaeological record only hints at politely. A multi-ethnic city is never just a pretty mosaic. It is also a place where different expectations about status, residence, labour and identity have to be worked out on the ground. The domestic side of this is just as important as the grand political side. One of the easiest mistakes to make with ancient cosmopolitanism is to imagine it only in terms of ambassadors, traders, and elite ceremonies, as though diversity lived mostly in official spaces and then went home before dark. Teotihuacan's apartment compounds suggest something more intimate. The Metropolitan Museum describes these compounds as collectivized residential structures, housing much of the population, and scholarship on migration in districts like Tlajinga suggests that movement into the city was not a rare or short-lived event. The 2021 dual isotope study found that immigration there was highest in the first centuries of compound occupation, but continued throughout the district's history. That implies that many compounds were not static family blocks, reproducing themselves in place for generation after generation, without interruption. They were porous enough to receive newcomers repeatedly. Some compounds may have had corporate identities strong enough to integrate migrants, while preserving collective organisation. Others may have been shaped by craft specialisation, neighbourhood role, or access to exchange routes. However exactly the process worked, it means city life in Teotihuacan was being remade constantly from within. Behind the ordered walls and gridded streets, the actual human composition of the city was in motion. There is also a subtle but important difference between a city that tolerates outsiders and a city that depends on them. Teotihuacan increasingly looks like the second kind. The obsidian economy, long-distance exchange, imported goods, neighbourhood centres, and evidence for enclaves all suggest that migrants were not decorative additions to an otherwise self-contained system. They were part of how the system worked. The Colorado volume notes that the merchant's barrio may have mediated contacts between Teotihuacan and the Maya through Gulf Coast peoples. The Oaxaca barrio clearly anchored one side of the city's relationship with Monte Alban and the wider Zapotec world. Teopancasco's multi-ethnic makeup has been connected to exchange systems and neighbourhood-level administration. When you put those threads together, the people who came from everywhere stop looking like marginal figures living in the cracks of a dominant order. They begin to look central to the order itself. Teotihuacan's scale required intermediaries, translators of practice, brokers of goods, families with outside ties, and communities capable of keeping roots of knowledge as alive as roots of trade. The city was not merely receiving difference, it was using it. At the same time, it would be a mistake to make the city sound too cheerful about all this, as though it were an ancient brochure for urban openness, full of smiling traders and respectful culinary exchange before everyone gathered for a thoughtfully inclusive festival. Multi-ethnic cities generate friction as reliably as they generate vitality. The PNAS piece on Teopancasco uses the words cooperation and tensions, which is refreshingly honest. Shared residence does not erase hierarchy. Exchange does not cancel competition. The same city that could house foreign communities was also a place of state power, organised ritual, sacrificial programs, and neighbourhood differentiation. Some outsiders likely prospered. Some were probably bound into subordinate roles. Some may have held prestige precisely because their foreign ties were useful. Others may have been marked as different in ways that mattered socially or politically. Even in Teopancasco, where diversity was clearly entrenched, the research points to changing patterns over time rather than a single stable social formula. This is worth remembering because it keeps Teotihuacan human. A city of many origins is not automatically harmonious. It is simply more complicated, and complication is often where the real energy of history lives. The isotope work adds another dimension to that human complexity because it lets us glimpse movement over a lifetime rather than only identity and burial. In Telajinga, migrants accounted for a very substantial part of the sampled population. In Teotihuacan, oxygen isotope evidence pointed to continual interaction with Oaxaca and other diaspora communities rather than one clean moment of transplantation. In the sacrificial victims of the feathered serpent pyramid, oxygen isotope studies found that at least 4 different regions were represented. Even if those victims are a special and grim category, their geographic diversity still shows that Teotihuacan's reach into human mobility was wide. Some people came as residents, some as traders or specialists, some as politically embedded foreigners, and some as captives or individuals caught in sacrificial machinery far from where they were born. The city gathered people in many ways. That too is part of what it means to say they came from everywhere. The phrase should not sound too comfortable. Teotihuacan drew in humanity along several pathways at once. Not all of them equal, not all of them voluntary, and not all of them survivable. And still, for all that tension, there is something strikingly durable about the city's ability to hold these populations together for centuries. Teotihuacan did not collapse the moment it became diverse, which is often the lazy fear of societies that secretly expect uniformity to do all the work. On the contrary, its growth and power seem to have depended on the fact that many kinds of people could live inside the same grid while participating in shared urban forms. Apartment compounds gave the city repeated units of organisation. Major avenues gave it common public experience. Ritual architecture gave it collective spectacle. Trade and craft gave people reasons to stay useful to one another. Foreign neighbourhoods could preserve elements of older identity while still plugging into the city's economy and ceremonial life. That combination may be one reason Teotihuacan remained so formidable for so long. It was not trying to erase every difference. It was trying to contain difference inside a larger order strong enough to make coexistence productive. Whether that larger order was ruled by kings, councils, factions, or corporate institutions remains debated, but the city itself demonstrates that somebody had learned how to make diversity legible without letting it dissolve the whole. This also changes how we hear the city's later silence. When Teotihuacan eventually fractured, the ruins did not belong only to one people whose story had ended. They belonged to the accumulated efforts of many communities, some local, some migrant, some deeply rooted, some constantly in motion. The burned core of the 6th century, the later depopulation, and the eventual mythic afterlife all took place over a social world that had once been far more mixed than the broken stones alone can show. That is part of why the site still feels so large even after so much has vanished. It was not only architecturally immense, it was socially immense. Under its painted walls and talud tableau facades, there were different accents, different household memories, different recipes, different burial customs, different routes home, and different ideas about what the city was for. If Teotihuacan was preparing for something, as we have been asking from the beginning, then one answer is that it was preparing to become a centre where many worlds could be gathered and managed at once. That was one of its greatest achievements, and perhaps one of its greatest strains. And once you let the city become crowded again in your mind, once you stop seeing only pyramids and start seeing Oaxaca families, Gulf Coast merchants, local craftspeople, near migrants from surrounding regions, possible Maya residents, and children born in compounds where several histories were already meeting under one roof, another question begins to matter more than before. A city this mixed cannot rely on bloodline alone to hold itself together. It needs shared signs, it needs timing, it needs a way to tell everyone, regardless of where they came from, that the world above them and the ground beneath them are still operating according to a pattern the city understands. That is where the sky and the earth begin to press closer together. A city as large and as carefully arranged as Teotihuacan could not rely on walls alone to explain itself. Roads and pyramids tell you where to walk and where to look, but they do not fully tell you when things matter. For that, a city needs signs. It needs recurring markers that reassure people the world is still moving in the order they expect, that the seasons have not gone astray, that ritual is being held at the proper moment, that planting and harvest are not being guessed at in a spirit of agricultural optimism and general hopefulness. This is where the sky becomes useful, and where Teotihuacan starts to feel even more deliberate than it already did. The city's ceremonial centre, according to the Metropolitan Museum, was laid out with unusual order, and the north-south causeway known as the Street of the Dead introduced an orientation of 15.5 degrees east of due north that structured the broader urban grid. That slight skew has fascinated researchers for decades, precisely because it does not look accidental. It looks like the kind of angle chosen for a reason, and once you start following the scholarly debate, the same conclusion keeps reappearing in different forms. Teotihuacan seems to have embedded time into space. The city was not only built to stand, it was built to indicate. That does not mean every stone in Teotihuacan can be treated like a giant calendar page, and it is worth resisting that temptation early. Ancient cities are very good at attracting theories, especially when their builders left no surviving explanatory manual for later convenience. Older archaeoastronomical work proposed several possible celestial references for the city's grid, including the Pleiades, Sirius, and the Sun. Later work by Ivan Spreis, one of the most cited specialists on Mesoamerican alignments, argued more specifically that the two slightly different orientation groups visible in the city plan were dictated by deliberate and astronomically functional orientations of the Pyramid of the Sun and the Ciudadela. In his reading, these structures recorded sunrises and sunsets on two different sets of dates, allowing the use of an observational calendar built from intervals that included multiples of 20 days and a 260-day period. That is a very important distinction. It moves the discussion away from vague admiration of stargazing ancestors and towards something more practical and more interesting. The possibility that Teotihuacan's architecture helps schedule agricultural and associated ritual activities in the yearly cycle. The sky, in other words, was not there merely to inspire awe. It was there to be used. Once you accept that possibility, the city starts to read differently. The Street of the Dead is no longer just a grand route through a ceremonial centre. It becomes a line through time as well as through space. A skewed city plan no longer feels like a curious quirk. It feels like a repeated reminder that the world's most important motions are not aligned to our convenience. The sun does not rise for architecture. Architecture has to decide how it will receive the sun. Spreis's work argues that the dates corresponding to the Teotihuacan alignments are attested at other central Mexican sites too, and that such orientations were employed primarily for scheduling agriculture and related rituals. That is a grounded, sober conclusion, and it has the advantage of making the city both more sacred and more practical at once. If you live in a place where rainfall, planting and seasonal transitions can decide whether tens of thousands of people eat well or badly, then a city that helps mark the right intervals is not indulging in symbolism. It is managing survival through a language that happens to involve horizons, mountains and sunlight. The Pyramid of the Sun sits at the heart of this discussion, and it does so in a way that feels almost unfairly perfect. We already know it was built over a cave, and the Metropolitan Museum notes that this cave may have been a place of emergence, a symbolic womb connected to creation myths and the underworld. But Spreis's study argues against the idea that the cave alone determined the pyramid's location. Instead, he suggests that the site was chosen through a combination of astronomical and topographic criteria. From that spot, the temple could be oriented to significant sunrises and sunsets, aligned in the perpendicular direction to Cerro Gordo to the north, and associated with quarter-day sunrises observed over a prominent mountain on the eastern horizon. That is a beautiful example of how signs in the sky and signs in the earth were not separate systems at Teotihuacan. The cave below, the mountain beyond, and the path of the sun above were all being folded into one architectural decision. The pyramid did not merely stand in the landscape. It gathered references from several layers of the world and held them in one place. That matters because it suggests the city's most important markers were never purely celestial. Teotihuacan does not seem to have treated the sky as an abstract dome full of mathematically tidy lights. It treated the sky as something always seen from somewhere, over something, in relation to something. A sunrise mattered because of the hill or volcano over which it appeared. A setting sun mattered because of the line it traced against a ridge, a pyramid edge, or a horizon notch. This is precisely why landscape mattered so much in the city's design. Smart history notes that the Pyramid of the Moon is framed by Cerro Gordo, and that this relationship demonstrates the harmony between architecture and natural topography. That sounds polite, but the effect is stronger than polite. The city seems to have needed the mountain in order to complete the meaning of the monument, just as the monument helped focus attention on the mountain. Signs in the sky were made legible by signs in the earth. The horizon was not a passive background. It was part of the instrument. A recent proposal highlighted by Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History makes this even more explicit for the Pyramid of the Moon. In July 2024, INA reported that a team from the Universidad del Tepeyac and INA argued the pyramid marked the astronomical axis of the ancient city. According to their observations, the pyramid's vertices align to the northeast with the summer solstice sunrise and to the southwest with the winter solstice sunset. The same statement says that, from the top of the Pyramid of the Moon on the longest day of the year, the sun rises over the Cihuingo volcano, which the researchers describe as having functioned as an observatory for calibrating the calendar. They also propose lateral alignments associated with dates such as 29th April, 13th August, 29th October, and 12th February, linking the monument to the agricultural calendar. It is wise to treat new alignment claims with care, especially in a field where impressive-looking lines can proliferate faster than certainty. Still, the fact that an official Mexican research announcement frames the Pyramid of the Moon in exactly these terms tells you how seriously the question is now being pursued. Teotihuacan is increasingly being read not as a city that happened to look impressive under the sky, but as one that was designed to work with it. Even without settling every archaeo-astronomical argument, one thing is already clear. The city's builders were watching repeatable events and caring deeply about repeatable intervals. The multiples of 20 days discussed by Sprague matter because the vigesimal counting system and the 260-day ritual cycle ran so deeply through Mesoamerican timekeeping. When architecture records solar positions that divide the year into intervals meaningful within that broader calendrical world, it does more than point at the horizon. It gives the city a way to anchor social time. When should rituals happen? When should agricultural work intensify? When should processions be staged? When should rulers or priests or neighbourhood leaders tell the population that one phase of the year is ending and another beginning? A city the size of Teotihuacan could not rely on everyone individually wandering into the countryside, gazing upward, and deciding by instinct that the maze probably felt optimistic this week. Shared timing had to be made public somehow, and architecture is very good at making public things feel undeniable. This is also why later equinox enthusiasm, however modern its style, is not completely detached from the site's deeper history. INA still manages large spring equinox crowds at Teotihuacan, and the continuing attraction of the site for solar events shows how naturally people still read the place as a point of contact between human bodies and celestial order. That does not mean modern visitors in white clothing with outstretched arms are reproducing ancient Teotihuacan rites in any straightforward sense. They are not. But it does mean the city still prompts the same intuition. That here, more than in an ordinary landscape, the sun seems to matter in a public way. Ancient builders were almost certainly more concerned with specific calendrical, agricultural and ritual functions than with vague energy tourism. But the persistence of solar gathering at the site is a reminder that Teotihuacan's design still succeeds at directing attention upward. 2,000 years later, people continue to arrive and ask the sky for confirmation. The earth side of this system was never less important. Signs below the horizon were just as active as signs above it. The cave beneath the Pyramid of the Sun was associated with emergence and creation imagery, according to the Met, while Smart History notes that the pyramids being built over a cave invites interpretation through origin and fertility myths. Elsewhere in the city, mural imagery also tied the living landscape to cosmic meaning. Smart History points to the Tepantitla mural often associated with the so-called Great Goddess, or more recently interpreted as a mountain tree figure, and notes the inverted U-shape beneath it that may function as a symbolic womb, similar to the cave found under the Pyramid of the Sun. That is an extraordinary visual echo. The city's art appears to repeat the same logic found in its architecture. The earth is not inert matter underfoot. It contains entrances, wombs, sources, rooted powers, and channels to other levels of existence. In such a world, signs in the earth are not just useful for geography, they're useful for understanding how life continues. The feathered serpent pyramid helps connect all this to time in an even more explicit way. Smart History notes that the temple's iconography includes a head some scholars identify as an early form of the fire serpent, Shu-Kotl, associated with warfare, fire and time, or the calendar. At the same time, the feathered serpent itself appears among shells and water imagery, linking the monument to aquatic power and fertility. That combination is very Teotihuacan. Fire and water, warfare and time, serpent and shell, monument and calendar are not kept in separate compartments. They are pressed into the same symbolic program, just as canals, offerings and processional routes were pressed into the same urban order. If the feathered serpent pyramid joined temporal and elemental signs in its sculptural program, then the city's messages were not restricted to what the sun did on the horizon a few times a year. They were repeated in the very surfaces people saw as they moved through public space. A well-run sacred city does not rely on one kind of reminder. It layers them until forgetting becomes difficult. And that layering may be one reason Teotihuacan could hold such a mixed population together for so long. A city of migrants, local families, foreign barrios, merchants, artisans and administrators needs common rhythms. It needs something larger than ancestry to coordinate experience. Shared public signs do that work remarkably well. If the avenue, the pyramids, the mountain, the cave, and the solar intervals all reinforce one another, then residents from different backgrounds can still inhabit one common temporal world. They may keep different memories of where their grandparents came from, but they can gather in the same plaza when the city tells them a transition matters. They can see the same sunrise marker, move along the same causeway, and understand that this date has consequences for planting, offerings, labour obligations, or public ritual. That does not erase ethnic or neighbourhood difference. It places those differences inside a larger order. Teotihuacan's genius may have been not simply in seeing the heavens, but in converting celestial repetition into civic cohesion. At the same time, none of this should be made too serene. People often speak of cosmic harmony, as though it meant everyone in the city looked at the sunset, nodded calmly, and felt that the universe was running with admirable efficiency. But cosmic order in Mesoamerican thought was rarely so relaxed. It had to be maintained. It required offerings, correct timing, and ritual attention. Later Nahua traditions remember Teotihuacan as the place where the gods assembled in darkness and sacrificed themselves to set the sun in motion, and UNESCO notes that the Aztec name of the city means the place where gods were created. Whether or not the original inhabitants would have told exactly that story, the memory is still revealing. It suggests later peoples looked at the site and saw a place built for moments when cosmic continuity could not be taken for granted. That fits very well with a city whose alignment seemed tied to calendrical function, and whose monuments were charged with buried deposits. Signs in the sky were important not because the universe was comfortably predictable, but because it had to be kept on schedule. The landscape around Teotihuacan, then, was not a scenic backdrop for monumental architecture. It was an active horizon of meaning. Cerro Gordo framed the moon pyramid. Xihuingo may have marked summer solstice sunrise in recent research. The eastern horizon mattered for quarter-day observations and Spreiter's analysis of the Sun Pyramid. The cave under the Sun Pyramid linked the city to emergence and the underworld. The city grid itself preserved these relationships in stone, so that people moving through Teotihuacan were always moving through a system of references larger than themselves. This is probably why the place still feels so intentional even now. A city planned around social convenience alone can age into picturesque disorder. Teotihuacan, for all its ruin, still feels like an argument. It keeps insisting that mountains, tunnels, avenues and light belonged in one conversation. And once you see that, the central question returns with a little more force than before. What were they preparing for? One answer is that they were preparing for recurrence, for the return of dates that mattered, for seasonal transitions that could not be missed, for the continued motion of a world whose continuity may have felt conditional rather than automatic. Signs in the sky let the city anticipate time. Signs in the earth let it anchor time to place. Together they made Teotihuacan feel less like a settlement, waiting on whatever tomorrow happened to bring, and more like a system trained to recognize the future before it arrived. A city built like that can be magnificent for centuries, but it also carries a risk of its own. The more a society depends on correctly managed signs, the more dangerous disorder becomes when the signs are interrupted, misread, or no longer sufficient to hold the centre. And that is where the next turn in the story begins to darken, because eventually something in Teotihuacan's carefully maintained order gave way, and the flames did not start out on the horizon. Fire is one of the easiest things to romanticize in ancient history, which is unfortunate because in real cities fire is usually less theatrical than people imagine, and more informative than they expect. At Teotihuacan, the burned remains do not look like the aftermath of one wild accident that got out of hand on a windy day and politely waited for future archaeologists to give it a dramatic title. The pattern is sharper than that. The Metropolitan Museum notes that around 550 CE, the city's core monuments were burned by unidentified persons, and its chronology for Mesoamerica adds that principal temples and elite residences in central Teotihuacan were burned and carved cult objects smashed, perhaps as part of an internal political and economic crisis. That wording matters. It shifts the scene from catastrophe in the abstract to targeted destruction in the political heart of the city. The fire did not merely reach the palaces by chance. It seems to have gone where power lived. That is one of the reasons the end of Teotihuacan feels so unnerving. For most of this story, the city has looked composed, regulated, and built to absorb uncertainty through ritual, geometry, infrastructure, and repetition. Then, at the crucial moment, the violence that appears most clearly in the archaeological record is not foreign armies marching in from outside, with the helpful clarity historians sometimes secretly wish for. Instead, what comes into view is selective destruction of the monuments and compounds most closely tied to state, cult, and elite authority. A major study of image destruction at Teotihuacan says the catastrophe was not a random urban blaze, but a premeditated, highly selective group action, with targets focused on palaces, temples, and administrative buildings, the very places that embodied political, religious, and economic power. That is a devastating sentence in historical terms. It means the people responsible, whoever exactly they were, knew where legitimacy was housed and acted accordingly. Once you look at the distribution of burning, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as general collapse with a bit of incidental damage to central monuments. In the same study, René Millon's survey work is summarized this way. Along the Street of the Dead, 147 buildings showed clear traces of incineration, and another 31 seemed to have been burned. Outside that corridor, roughly 53% of examined temples had been victims of fire, compared with only 14% of apartment compounds. That contrast is one of the most useful numbers in the entire Teotihuacan story. It tells us the city was not uniformly consumed. the destruction was concentrated far more heavily in ritual and civic structures than in ordinary residential compounds. Put plainly, this was not just a city burning. It was a governing order being attacked through its architecture. The flames reached the palaces because the palaces, or the elite compounds functioning like them, were part of the point. That difference between a citywide disaster and a selective assault may sound technical, but it changes the human meaning of the event completely. A random fire is tragic, a focused one is political. If large ceremonial buildings and elite residences were singled out while many apartment compounds were less affected, then we are no longer looking at simple misfortune. We are looking at hostility directed toward institutions, the great avenue that once staged order became the corridor along which the signs of order were damaged. Temples that had organised movement, sacrifice, and public visibility became targets. Administrative and elite spaces ceased to be protected centres and turned into exposed symbols. Even later summaries from the Met preserve this logic. Burned monuments, smashed cult objects, and a crisis that is plausibly internal. That is not the picture of a society gently fading because trade became inconvenient or the younger generation lost interest in monumental staircases. It is the picture of a system whose centre became vulnerable to people willing to break it open. Zala makes this especially vivid. The Zala compound, located in the core of the city between the Sun and Moon pyramids, has long attracted attention because its size, location, internal complexity, mural painting, and luxury materials make it a strong candidate for one of the seats of Teotihuacan government. The destruction study describes it in exactly those terms, as a place whose features may indicate one of the seats of government, and notes that all internal circulation routes in its central plaza converged on what seems to have been a main ritual theatre. In other words, Zala was not just a nice residence in a good neighbourhood. It was one of the places where rule may have been performed, materialised, and protected. So when evidence of concentrated destruction shows up there, it is hard not to read that as an attack on the public face of authority itself. The fire did not just reach an elite address. It reached one of the places where the city may have explained itself to itself, and the destruction at Zala was not subtle. The same study reports that its central plaza yielded abundant evidence of violent damage, and that the destruction seems to have been concentrated there. Floors showed signs of burning, beams were charred, roofs collapsed and hardened in the fire, decorative elements were torn from facades, and mythological sculptures were damaged. Archaeomagnetic data from burned floors in Structure E3 placed the disaster around AD 550, while a later radiocarbon and archaeomagnetic model for the Zala palatial complex describes burned lime plasters as part of the Big Fire associated with Teotihuacan's abandonment. Those are the kinds of findings that make a ruin feel less passive. You can almost reconstruct the sequence in reverse. Fire set where it would matter, roofs falling, surfaces cracking, ornament ripped away, and the compound that once concentrated exclusivity suddenly opened to violent refusal. What happened to the images inside these places may be even more revealing than the fire itself. Burning a building damages property. Smashing a cult image attacks meaning. The Met chronology says carved cult objects were smashed during the crisis. The Zala destruction study goes into greater detail, showing that sculptures from elite ritual settings were not merely caught in collapse, but intentionally broken and sometimes dispersed. In Structure 1Q behind the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, for example, a sculpture was found broken into numerous fragments mixed with charcoal and ash on the burned floor, with the pieces scattered over an area of about 800 square metres around the temple. At Zala, the same authors analyse a white marble sculpture, marked by repeated blows, and use that evidence to discuss iconoclasm, not accidental breakage. Once images are being deliberately reduced to fragments, the violence has moved past seizure of buildings into the destruction of the sacred language that justified those buildings. Somebody wanted more than access. Somebody wanted the city's official symbols to stop working. That is the point at which the fires begin to look less like a collapse and more like an argument carried out with extraordinary force. For centuries, Teotihuacan had organised public life through visible hierarchies. Some people ascended stairways, some stood below, some compounds controlled luxury materials, some neighbourhoods mediated long-distance exchange, some institutions managed ritual and the political theatre surrounding it. The PNAS study by Linda Manzanilla is useful here because it describes Teotihuacan as a corporate society with tensions built into it. Around the core, intermediate elites fostered the movement of luxury goods and specialised workers, while neighbourhood competition over identity and display intensified. Her conclusion is especially suggestive. The contrast between corporate organisation at the base and top of society and the exclusionary organisation of neighbourhoods led by competitive, intermediate elites introduced tensions that set the stage for Teotihuacan's collapse. That does not tell us exactly who lit which fire. It does tell us that the city's elegance may have concealed a long internal strain. The destruction in the monumental core may therefore have been less a sudden madness than the visible breaking point of pressures that had been developing for some time. This is also why the phrase, "the fires that reached the palaces," works better than "the city burned down." The latter suggests one moment. The former suggests a boundary crossed. Palaces, or whatever elite residences and government compounds we use to fill that category in Teotihuacan, exist to separate. They separate rulers from ruled, ceremony from ordinary traffic, restricted space from common space, and legitimacy from challenge. When fire reaches them, something fundamental has changed. The defensive distance between authority and the rest of the city has failed. And because Teotihuacan's elite structures were not simple houses, but places entangled with ritual, public symbolism, and state administration, the crossing of that boundary was also ideological. The assault was not only against people, it was against the city's claim that power belonged safely at the centre, and that the centre could maintain the world around it. It is worth being careful here, because archaeology does not hand us a tidy courtroom transcript of the event. We do not possess a Teotihuacan witness saying, "On this day, these factions rose, these compounds were breached, these leaders fled, and this symbol was smashed for this exact reason." The evidence is powerful, but it is still material evidence. It gives us burning patterns, broken images, dates from floors and plasters, and the spatial concentration of violence in monumental and elite sectors. The Met chronology therefore speaks cautiously of an internal, political and economic crisis, not a solved case. That caution should stay with us. Still, not knowing every actor does not make the pattern less sharp. The selection of targets remains the central fact. Power was attacked where it was most legible. That is enough to say the fires were meaningful, not incidental. Another detail that often gets lost is that the fire did not instantly erase the city. The Metropolitan Museum notes that after 600 CE, the population dropped markedly, and between 600 and 800 CE Teotihuacan may have held 30,000 people or fewer. Its chronology adds that many apartment compounds were abandoned, but parts of the site remained inhabited until about 900. This matters because it prevents us from imagining a single night in which everything ended and silence arrived before sunrise. That is not how large cities usually die. The central order can be broken first, and the city can continue afterward in diminished, altered, wounded form. Teotihuacan seems to have followed that more complicated path. The ceremonial and elite heart was struck hard around the mid-6th century, but people remained. Neighbourhoods persisted unevenly. Life did not stop all at once. Instead, the city lost the particular arrangement of authority that had made it Teotihuacan in the grand, commanding sense. After that, survival and continuation became smaller, patchier things. That slow afterlife makes the destruction even sadder in a practical way. Imagine what it means for a metropolis built on alignment, centralised ceremony, neighbourhood competition, long-distance exchange, and repeated acts of monumental renewal to lose its core institutions but not disappear immediately. The roads are still there, many compounds are still there, the skills are still there, the city is not physically gone. But the confidence that held these parts together has been damaged. The temples and palatial compounds no longer serve as unquestioned anchors. Cult images have been broken. Important plazas bear the mark of deliberate burning. The machine of public order still occupies space, but some of its crucial gears have been ripped out. A city can survive that for a while, just as a body can survive an injury that has already changed its future. What it cannot do easily is pretend nothing decisive has happened. And this brings us back to the larger question we have been following from the beginning. What were they preparing for? Up to this point, one reasonable answer has been that Teotihuacan was preparing for recurrence. Solar intervals, seasonal transitions, the management of water, the provisioning of sacred foundations, the integration of many peoples under one urban order. But the fire suggests another possibility. The city may also have been preparing, consciously or not, for conflict generated by its own success. A highly organised metropolis concentrates wealth, symbols, raw materials, foreign communities, neighbourhood rivalries, and elite claims to control. That kind of concentration produces power, and it also produces resentment, competition, and strain. The P&AS argument about tensions between corporate organisation and exclusionary neighbourhood competition does not prove that one faction carried torches to one compound on one date. What it does offer is a way to understand why Teotihuacan's breakdown took the form it did. The city was vulnerable at exactly the points where its authority had been most carefully staged. There is something almost cruelly appropriate in that. Teotihuacan had built itself as a place where order could be seen, walked, ascended and repeated. It tied mountains to pyramids, caves to origin, water to state display, obsidian to economy and ritual, and time itself to architecture. Then, when the crisis came, the destruction also became visible, walkable, and memorable. Fire marked the avenue, burned floors fixed dates into plaster, broken sculptures turned state imagery into rubble. What had once persuaded later peoples that this was a place where gods were made would, after the catastrophe, persuade them of something else as well. That an explanation had been lost on a very large scale. Later visitors inherited the stones, but not the argument. They inherited the city after its own centre had been broken, and once that happens, memory does what it usually does with ruins this large. It begins replacing damaged history with stories powerful enough to stand where certainty used to be. After the fires, the strangest thing about Teotihuacan is not that it fell quiet. Cities fall quiet all the time. Walls empty out, roofs collapse, plaster peels, weeds arrive with the patient confidence of professionals who know they will eventually inherit everything, and the business of ordinary life moves elsewhere. What makes Teotihuacan different is what happened once the quiet had been there long enough. The silence did not stay empty. It filled with interpretation. It filled with reverence. It filled with later people walking among enormous ruins and deciding, quite reasonably in their own terms, that this could not have been only a dead city. It had to have been the scene of something larger. UNESCO says that after the destruction and abandonment of the city around 650 CE, the ruins were imbued with legend, and it notes that the Aztec name Teotihuacan means the place where gods were created. The Metropolitan Museum says the city's legacy continued to resonate throughout Mesoamerica for at least a millennium after its decline. That is the key point here. Teotihuacan did not simply leave debris behind. It left a setting powerful enough to keep producing meaning long after its original institutions had vanished. That is usually how myth begins in places like this, not as foolishness, not as decorative fantasy, but as an attempt to explain a scale of human work that has outlived its paperwork. Later Nahua-speaking peoples, including the Mexica, didn't arrive with access to Teotihuacan's original city archives, founding speeches, building dedications, tax records, or priestly calendars neatly bound and shelved for future consultation. They encountered the remains, They saw pyramids larger than anything most people ever build, a ceremonial avenue of astonishing discipline, and a landscape whose order still felt deliberate centuries after the living city was gone. The result was not indifference, it was elevation. Britannica notes that in Aztec times the name Teotihuacan could be understood as City of the Gods, or where men became gods, while UNESCO preserves the related formulation, the place where gods were created. These are not modest labels, they are acts of recognition under pressure from architecture. When a ruined city still feels bigger than explanation, people do not tend to reduce it. They raise it into the realm of origins, and in Mexican memory, Teotihuacan did not become sacred in a vague way. It became the place where cosmic emergency had once been resolved. Britannica's summary of Aztec religion says that at Teotihuacan, in darkness, the gods gathered around a great fire. Nanahuatzin and Techiztecatl cast themselves into the flames and emerged as the sun and moon, and the new sun would not move until the other gods also gave their blood. Smart History, in its site overview, says that much later the Aztecs made pilgrimages there and believed it was the city where the gods lived and where the fifth sun was created. What matters about that story is not only its grandeur, though it certainly has plenty of that. It is the logic of it. The world does not continue by itself. Light must be generated. Motion must be purchased. Time begins not with comfort but with sacrifice. For a city whose monuments already suggested cosmic management, this later myth was almost a perfect fit. The ruins looked like the kind of place where existence itself might once have stalled and needed to be restarted properly. That fit between architecture and myth is one of the most useful things about the later tradition, even if we are careful not to confuse Mexican memory with original Teotihuacan belief. The people who built the city were not the Aztecs, and the great metropolis had already been in decline for centuries before the Mexica rose to power. But later myths still tell us something crucial, what the ruins themselves seem to say. The city still looked like a beginning. It still looked like the sort of place where gods might gather, or where divine and human histories might overlap. The Met's 2025 reopening announcement for the Ancient Americas Galleries states that Teotihuacan was considered the birthplace of the gods by the Mexica and had become an important pilgrimage site by the 15th century. That is a very long afterlife for a dead city. The site was not only remembered in books or speeches, it was revisited with bodies. People went there, they moved through it, they kept activating it through presence. That is how silence turns into sacred geography. It is not enough to tell stories about a place, you also have to keep walking back into it. Pilgrimage matters here because it turns memory into habit. A legend can be recited anywhere. A pilgrimage requires roads, intention, social rank, offerings, and repeated return. Britannica notes that although the city had been largely deserted since its decline, the Aztec royal house made annual pilgrimages to the site. UNESCO adds a more exact ritual detail drawn from 16th century writings. The sacrifices practiced there by Moctezuma every 20 days testified to the persistence of belief and to Teotihuacan's exceptional sacred value. This is not the behaviour of a society treating the ruins as a sentimental historical attraction. It is the behaviour of a state using an older sacred landscape to reinforce its own cosmology and authority. The Mexica did not merely admire Teotihuacan, they folded it into living ritual. They allowed the ruins to continue doing political and religious work in a new age. A broken city had become a functioning point in a later empire's map of the world. There is something very practical about that, even if the language surrounding it is divine. Rulers have always liked old sacred places, especially when those places are impressive enough to suggest continuity older than the current regime. If you're trying to govern a world that feels unstable, then connecting yourself to an older centre of cosmic authority is a strong move. It tells subjects, allies, rivals, and perhaps even yourself that your rule does not begin with you. It joins your present to a deeper past. In Teotihuacan's case, The ruins offered exactly that sort of resource. They were old enough to be mysterious, large enough to be convincing, and silent enough to accept new interpretation. UNESCO's note about Moctezuma's recurring sacrifices, combined with the broader Mexica belief that this was where the gods created the current sun, suggests that pilgrimage to Teotihuacan was never only devotion, it was also legitimacy. To stand there, offer there and return there was to place the Mexica state in conversation with the oldest and largest sacred city its rulers knew. The landscape itself helped that reinterpretation along. Later names like the Avenue of the Dead were already acts of myth-making. Smart history explains that the avenue's modern name reflects a later belief that the mounds lining it were tombs, and in its video overview the speakers note how impressed later Aztec pilgrims were by the site. Once you imagine the city as a place of divine creation, the great processional route naturally becomes something more than urban planning. It becomes a path through memory. The pyramids become more than platforms. They become the surviving shells of original events. The city's emptiness helps, because emptiness is generous to imagination. A living city answers back. A ruin allows later people to ask larger questions and then hear their own cosmology echo from the stones. Teotihuacan was especially good at that because its design was already monumental, axial, and obviously ceremonial. It practically invited later viewers to conclude that the visible architecture had been built for moments far larger than daily life. That does not mean the Mexica were inventing everything from nothing. Later interpretation usually works by fastening onto real features that remain persuasive even after their first meanings are lost. Teotihuacan's extraordinary scale, its geometric order, its pyramids, its sacred avenue, its relationship to mountains and cave spaces, and its long-standing reputation as a centre of power, all made it especially suitable for myths of creation, sacrifice, and cosmic renewal. The city had always been a place where public life was arranged through formal movement and overwhelming architecture. Later, people simply received that message through their own religious vocabulary. In a way, this is one of the strongest compliments the ruins could receive. Even stripped of paint, population, and administration, they still looked like a place where the world had once been managed. That is why the myth of the fifth sun settled so naturally there. The city was already telling people that order had to be staged, repeated, and maintained. Mexica tradition gave that impression a specific story. There is also a quieter side to this afterlife, and I think it matters just as much as the big creation narrative. Once a place becomes mythic, it starts attracting not only rulers and official rituals, but also smaller acts of personal orientation. A pilgrimage site is where empires go to borrow legitimacy, certainly, but it is also where ordinary people go to stand near something larger than themselves. Teotihuacan offered that in abundance. The ruins were close enough to the basin of Mexico to remain accessible, famous enough to matter, and mysterious enough to feel old in the deepest possible sense. Smart history describes later Aztec pilgrims approaching the site from Tenochtitlan and feeling astonishment. That emotional response is worth keeping in view, or is part of how myths stay alive. A sacred story attached to an unimpressive place can survive in books. A sacred story attached to pyramids of this size survives in the body. You arrive, you look up, and the explanation starts feeling plausible before anyone finishes telling it. This is also where memory becomes selective in a very human way. Later people did not primarily preserve Teotihuacan as a story about apartment compounds, drainage systems, obsidian workshop districts, or the complications of multi-ethnic urban management. They preserved it as a story about gods, beginnings, sacrifice, and sacred authority. That is not because the practical systems were unimportant. It is because myth tends to save what can still organize meaning after administrative detail is gone. No one builds a pilgrimage around mid-level urban logistics, however historically essential they may have been. People return to places that seem to touch first things: creation, death, light, motion, renewal. In that sense, the later myths around Teotihuacan are not a distortion so much as a narrowing. They take the city's most overpowering qualities and compress them into a form later generations can carry. The vast planned metropolis becomes the place where the gods made the sun move. The dead capital becomes the birthplace of divine order. That is not the whole truth of Teotihuacan, but it is a truth about the effect it continued to have. And this is where this silence becomes most interesting, because it was never really silent at all. It just changed speakers. First, the city had spoken through rulers, rituals, processions, murals, buried offerings, workshops, and monumental alignments. Then, that voice broke. Afterward, later Mesoamerican peoples, especially the Mexica, answered the stones with their own explanation. The ruins became a dialogue between lost intention and later recognition. UNESCO's wording is very precise when it says the site was imbued with legend. Legend was not an accidental coating applied from outside. It was the medium through which Teotihuacan remained alive after its original social order had gone. That is why the myths matter historically. They are evidence not of the city's first voice, but of its continued power. Even abandoned, it still forced later civilizations to account for it. By the time we reach this point in the story, the ruins are doing two kinds of work at once. They preserve evidence of a real city that once managed water, organized labor, housed migrants, marked celestial cycles, buried offerings, and staged authority on an enormous scale. At the same time, they host later stories about the birth of the sun and moon, the sacrifice of the gods, and the sacred value of return. Those two layers should not be collapsed into one, but they should not be torn too far apart either. The myths do not tell us exactly what the builders thought, but they tell us with surprising clarity what the city felt like centuries later. It still felt foundational. It still felt prepared for beginnings. It still felt like a place where the world might have been put back into motion. And that may be the best bridge we could ask for into the last question, because after the fires and after the silence and after the myths, we are finally in a position to gather all the pieces and ask it directly without rushing. If Teotihuacan looked to later people like the place where time itself was restarted, what, in the city's own lifetime, were its builders actually preparing for? So what were they preparing for? The most honest answer is that they were not preparing for one single event, not one invasion, not one prophecy, not one apocalyptic date circled in red on a priestly calendar. They were preparing for continuity under pressure. That is the clearest reading that fits the city as a whole. Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the ancient world, laid out with unusual discipline, anchored by a monumental ceremonial core, gridded residential compounds, and institutions strong enough to organize labour, trade, ritual and infrastructure over a very large urban area. A place built like that is not waiting passively for the future. It is trying to manage it. The city's scale, its carefully repeated alignments, its apartment compounds, its integration of sacred and practical spaces, and its long influence across Mesoamerica all suggest a society determined to make order visible and durable. No single inscription survives to tell us, in their own words, what they feared most. But the architecture, deposits, and city plans strongly suggest that they believe stability had to be made, maintained, and renewed. The first part of that preparation was temporal. Teotihuacan seems to have been built not just to occupy land, but to track recurrence. The city's grid is famously skewed about 15.5 degrees east of north. An archaeoastronomical work by Ivan Spreich argues that the orientations of major monuments such as the Pyramid of the Sun and the Ciudadela were deliberately tied to sunrise and sunset positions on dates meaningful for agricultural and ritual scheduling. His conclusion is not that the city was a giant horoscope carved into the valley for entertainment between sacrifices, but that these orientations likely helped structure agricultural timing and ceremonial cycles using intervals meaningful in Mesoamerican calendrical thought. Later research promoted by Aina on the Pyramid of the Moon also argues that alignments there linked the monument to solstitial events and agriculturally significant dates. The most grounded inference is that Teotihuacan was preparing for the return of critical moments in the year: planting, seasonal transitions, ritual obligations, and the repeated need to reassure a large population that time was moving correctly. The second part was environmental. Large cities do not survive by symbolism alone, however good the symbolism may look from a distance. Teotihuacan altered the course of the San Juan River, integrated canals and drainage into the city grid, and developed a hydraulic system that helped manage runoff, storage, and dry season needs while also reinforcing the sacred and political message of major ceremonial areas. The city's land and water system was not a background utility, it was part of the way power worked. Evans and Nichols describe a formal hydrological system that developed alongside monumental and residential construction, and UNESCO notes that natural elements of the valley were deliberately incorporated into the urban design. That means the city was preparing for the basic problem that every large settlement in a fragile environment must solve. Water does not arrive on command, flood risk does not politely cancel itself, and populations of this size require organised control over flow. If the city's rulers or governing institutions made water management visible near major ritual zones, the message was simple enough. They were not only honouring the forces of nature, they were presenting themselves as the people who could keep those forces within workable limits. Then there is the underworld side of the question, which may be the most revealing of all. The Pyramid of the Sun was built over a cave that the Metropolitan Museum describes as a possible place of emergence, linked to creation myths and the underworld in Mesoamerican thought. The location and orientation of that cave may even have influenced the placement of the pyramid itself. At the same time, the Moon Pyramid was framed by Cerro Gordo in a way that made natural topography part of the city's sacred composition. The builders were not only raising mass upward, they were binding monuments to caves, mountains, horizons, and other features that likely carried deep meanings of origin, fertility, and sacred geography. The most reasonable inference is that Teotihuacan was preparing not just for ordinary civic life, but for a world in which the relationship between human society and the deeper structure of the cosmos had to be stabilized in place. A city does not monumentalize a cave of emergence because it thinks beginnings are trivial. It does so because beginnings still matter, perhaps because they must be revisited, renewed, or kept available through ritual. That is exactly where the buried offerings begin to make sense. At the Moon Pyramid, excavations revealed multiple dedicatory burial and offering complexes tied to successive enlargement phases, containing greenstone, obsidian, shell, pyrite, wood, textiles, sacrificed humans, and powerful predatory animals. The Cambridge report on those deposits concludes that they were symbols of state religious ideology and communicated socio-political information on behalf of ruling elites. At the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, Inner notes foundation offerings that included human remains dedicated either to the construction itself or to the deity. These are not commemorative trinkets. They are costly deposits hidden inside architecture at the moments when architecture becomes official. The clearest inference is that the builders believed monuments were not complete until they had been provisioned for the future. Bodies, blades, stones, mirrors, shells, and predators were placed where they could no longer serve ordinary human use. That means their purpose was expected to continue after burial. Teotihuacan was preparing its buildings to keep working in silence. The same is true, perhaps even more strongly, at the level of state power. Obsidian was probably Teotihuacan's most important commercial specialization, and Britannica notes control of prized green obsidian sources near Pachuca and the production of millions of blades, points, knives, and scrapers for distribution. Research on workshop districts confirms that large-scale obsidian craft production was embedded in the city's life, with many workshops operating across urban neighbourhoods. At the same time, the material appears in ritual deposits and sacrificial contexts, linking production, warfare, and sacred authority. This means the city was preparing materially as well as spiritually. It was building the means to arm, cut, trade, offer, and display power in the same substance. Obsidian let Teotihuacan turn geology into economy, and economy into ideology. A city with that kind of control is not simply wealthy. It is equipping itself for long-term dominance, for the management of labour and exchange, and for the symbolic reinforcement of rule. In plain terms, they were preparing to remain central. There is another layer that becomes obvious once you remember how many people lived there and where they came from. The city was not socially simple. The Met describes a metropolis of apartment compounds housing most of the population, while migration and genetic studies show that Teotihuacan was genuinely multi-ethnic. Research at Tlajinga found major migrant presence. Work at Teopan Casco supports the neighbourhood's multi-ethnic character, and PNAS describes Teotihuacan as a complex multi-ethnic settlement from early on, shaped in part by displaced populations and later by specialised neighbourhoods and long-distance ties. That matters because a city of this size and diversity cannot depend on ancestry alone to hold itself together. It needs common calendars, common routes, common ritual stages, common ways of making strangers intelligible inside one order. The most convincing interpretation is that Teotihuacan was preparing for the management of mixture. Its architecture and ceremonial timing were not only about the gods, they were also about social coordination in a city where many people came from elsewhere and had to be folded into something larger than neighbourhood memory. This is why I think the central answer is not they were preparing for disaster, in the narrow sense, though disaster certainly came. They were preparing for maintenance of time, of water, of legitimacy, of fertility, of hierarchy, of cooperation among unlike groups, and perhaps of the cosmic order itself. Later Naha-speaking peoples called the place Teotihuacan, the place where gods were created, and UNESCO notes that by the 16th century Moctezuma was said to offer sacrifices there every 20 days. That later memory cannot be treated as a direct window into the minds of the city's original builders, but it is still revealing. It shows that centuries later the ruin still felt like a place where the world had once been set in motion and might still require attention. The Mexica did not look at Teotihuacan and think, this must have been an efficient mid-level administrative centre with solid drainage. They looked at it and saw beginnings. That later interpretation fits remarkably well with the archaeological pattern of a city built to renew and stabilise forces larger than daily convenience. At the same time, the city's collapse warns us against making Teotihuacan sound too successful in its own terms. Around the mid-6th century, major monuments and elite or administrative structures in the city's core were selectively burned, while apartment compounds were much less affected. Studies of the destruction emphasise that the violence appears targeted rather than random, aimed at palaces, temples, and the symbolic heart of authority. The Metropolitan Museum likewise describes the burning of central monuments and the smashing of carved cult objects as part of what may have been an internal political and economic crisis. Linda Manzanilla's work on Teotihuacan as a corporate society, with tensions between neighbourhood competition and broader organisation, offers one strong framework for reading that outcome. If that interpretation is right, then one more answer to our question appears. They were preparing, knowingly or not, for the strain produced by their own system. A city capable of integrating resources, rituals, migrants and prestige on this scale also concentrates resentment, rivalry and fragility at its centre. The same machinery that produced order made the breakdown catastrophic when trust in the centre failed. So the most accurate conclusion is layered. Teotihuacan was preparing for the next season, the next ritual cycle, the next building phase, the next transfer of goods, the next gathering of a mixed population under one visible order. It was preparing for continuity in a world it did not regard as self-sustaining. It may also have been preparing, through sacrifice and sacred architecture, for the possibility that continuity itself had to be purchased over and over again. The city's alignment suggests attention to recurring dates. Its cave and mountain relationships suggest concern with origins and sacred geography. Its buried offerings suggest that buildings needed invisible charges placed inside them. Its canals and obsidian workshops show an urban regime organised around material control. Its multi-ethnic neighbourhoods show that the city had to manage difference as a permanent condition. Put together, these do not point to one secret doomsday scenario. They point to a civilization trying to keep a large human world in working order by tying it to a larger cosmic one. And that, I think, is why Teotihuacan still feels tense even now. The city was enormously confident, but it was not casual. Its monuments are too careful for that. Its deposits are too costly. Its waterworks are too deliberate. Its orientations are too disciplined. Everything about it suggests a society that believed the future could be shaped if the right structures were built, the right intervals observed, the right offerings buried, and the right people gathered into the right spaces. There is something very human in that. We do this too, in our own way. We build institutions, calendars, reservoirs, archives, and systems of trust, because we know life does not remain stable without repeated effort. Teotihuacan did the same, except it made the process much larger, much more sacred, and much harder to miss from a distance. When later peoples looked at the ruins and decided this must be where gods were made, they were not only inventing a myth, they were recognizing the scale of the original ambition. So if I had to answer the question in one sentence, after all of this, I would put it this way. They were preparing for a world that would keep going only if humans helped hold it together. That is why the city looks the way it does. That is why time was built into stone. That is why caves mattered, why mountains mattered, why water had to be directed, why obsidian had to be controlled, why animals and people were buried in the monuments, why the avenues were broad enough for collective movement, and why later generations, meeting the silence after the city's fall, still felt that this had been the place where something essential once began. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of Teotihuacan. It was not built by people waiting for the end. It was built by people working very hard to prevent it.